moderating this conversation tonight, and I'm going to have help from Aaron Tews, who has been helping people check in over here. Aaron is our community liaison for southeastern Arizona. These liaisons, we have 5 or 6 of them throughout Arizona. They really help us with engaging with the community, going to your meetings, finding out what is of importance to you, and so that's a very powerful thing. So thank you so much, Aaron, for helping us out tonight. So welcome all, and thank you for your participation. We wanted to clarify that this is an informal community meeting and not the formal public hearing. That public hearing will take place on September 10th, but we're hosting this community meeting to make sure you're informed about Copper World air quality permit process, and we're happy to take questions in this forum. Just to clarify, like I said, this isn't the official time for submitting formal public comments. But don't worry, we'll let you know how to submit those comments for the upcoming public hearing. And we'll go into more detail about that later in the meeting. So feel free to ask questions as we get to that point tonight. So I wanted to just share with you our stated purpose for this meeting. The stated purpose is we're holding this informal meeting to help the community understand ADEQ's air quality permit for Copper World Inc., the proposed open pit copper mine to be located in Pima County, Arizona. I didn't ask this ahead of time, and I probably should have to my colleagues. Do we have any elected officials in the audience tonight? Okay. Then I can tell those really bad jokes. They won't get after me. All right. What's that? Yeah, I know that. I'm aware of that. We were here a few months ago, and we're here for the aquifer protection permit. I see a lot of familiar faces, so thank you for coming back again. All right, so I wanted to just share a few tips for a good meeting. This is just kind of something that sets the tone that we like to do. So tonight, as we're having this conversation, please share from your experience and perspective. Please listen when others are speaking. We want to allow space for all to participate, and what that means is we ask that you speak briefly, be focused, and be on topic. Also, be generous. We at ADEQ want to be open to community input, and we ask that you do the same for us as we go through this. We also ask that all present be respectful and kind, and we believe that this will lead to good outcomes. So I'm going to turn over some time now to Aaron Tews, and he's going to go over some housekeeping items for everybody.
Thank you, Justin. I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Aaron Tews. I'm the community liaison for Southeast Arizona. And tonight I'm going to go over some of our housekeeping items. So out the door here and just to the right are the restrooms. For water, off here to my left, right next to the microwave, there's some water cups if you guys get thirsty. Emergency exits here and here, your closest emergency exits. For other items, we have agendas up by the front of the room. Ms. Roxanne is there. We have the smart comment QR code and link on those agendas, so you can scan that with your phone or type in the link, and it'll take you to the comment portal where you can leave a comment, and then that'll be included in a responsiveness summary later on. Also, my business card, Justin's business card, and Apology, our facilities emissions section manager's card will be up there. And of course, if you didn't sign in, please sign in. We have a fact sheet as well, just to tell you a little bit about the permit. So please know that if you want to ask questions tonight, you can put your name on the sheet here to sign up to speak. And that's how we're going to be able to ensure that we can address as many people as possible. We'll call people up to speak in the order that they sign their name. If you have any challenges coming up to the podium, or would prefer that the staff read your question, indicate that. And we will take down any questions we can't answer today as action items. And just for any Spanish speakers, si necesita servicios de traducción, comuníquese con Karla Murrieta aquí durante las preguntas y respuestas. So thank you guys.
All right, thank you so much, Aaron. So I wanted to do some introductions of the folks that are here with us, my colleagues from ADEQ. We've already met Aaron, and with us tonight, our Director of the Air Quality Division, Daniel Shekolinsky, is with us. We also have Balaji Vaidyanathan, our manager for facility emissions control, right? And Jeff Christensen, who is a permit engineer. And both of those gentlemen will be presenting shortly here. We already kind of heard about Karla Murrieta. She's our manager of air quality permits and also a Spanish speaker if anybody needs translation. We also have Dr. Feng Mao here. He's an air quality modeler. Also Rob Vervel, who is an air quality inspector, sitting up here in the front. Thank you for coming tonight, Rob. Also very grateful to have Michelle Refuerzo and Roxanne Lindsay here tonight. So Michelle is our outreach events coordinator. She's also one of our collaborators in community science with volunteers from this region. So we really appreciate that work. And then Roxanne is one of our legislative analysts at ADEQ. So I wanted to turn over a little bit of time for opening comments to Daniel. I'm just going to give you a quick bio here. Daniel was appointed as ADEQ's Air Quality Division Director in October of 2019 after serving as Acting Director and Deputy Director since June of 2018. His role as Director involves protecting public health and the environment by helping control present and future air pollution sources. In this position, he oversees the following Arizona air quality programs, and those are the Ambient Monitoring Network, Pollution Forecasting, Compliance and Enforcement, Permitting, Vehicle Emissions Inspections, and the development of state implementation plans and rules. That's quite a bit of stuff. Daniel has been with ADEQ since November of 2006, holding several positions in the Water Quality Division, including the Drinking Water Manager, where he was responsible for the implementation and enforcement of the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act through various ADEQ programs. Prior to joining ADEQ, Daniel had a 15-year career with Clean Harbors and Laidlaw Environmental Services facilities in Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Washington. Daniel also received his bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in 1988 and received his certification in hazardous materials management from the Institute of Hazardous Materials Management in 2001. So we'll go ahead and turn over some time now to Daniel.
Thank you, Justin. As Justin said, I'm Daniel Triplinski. I'm the Air Quality Division Director at ADEQ. I really want to welcome and thank you for attending. Really happy to see a large crowd here. We really want to talk about what's going on. What we're going to do first is have a brief presentation on what the permitting process is for Copper World, what the Clean Air Act requirements, including the compliance-based National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, are, and we're going to talk about the draft permit for Copper World. So that's going to take about 45 minutes to an hour. So Balaji and Jeff are going to be talking on that, so I appreciate you guys listening to them. Hopefully some of the questions you have will get answered then. If not, we're open to questions. We reserve most of the time this evening, as Justin already said, approximately 2 hours to hear from you, the community. It's really an opportunity for ADEQ to interact informally with the community. We want to respond and answer your questions and concerns. We're committed to providing you answers that are understandable. So if you don't understand an answer, please ask again, right, so you can understand it. These are complex technical issues. I struggle at times with it. I have my team here to help me understand these complex decisions, the complex chemistry and math that goes along with the permitting process, so I can make the proper policy decisions. So really want to hear from everyone in the audience that wants to speak. So, Justin?
Okay, thank you, Daniel. We want to leave time for you all to ask your questions and have this conversation tonight. So I'm going to get through some bios here for Balaji and Jeff, and then we're going to go into that presentation. Hopefully we'll be able to get going, maybe in about an hour or so with the questions and answers. To get into those bios, well, let me just tell you a few things here. So first of all, wanted to inform you that this meeting is going till 9 p.m. this evening. We do foresee that some of our folks might be able to stay around after. Some of them need to get back to the valley, but a few of us will stay around and answer questions at the end. And as Aaron said, if you have questions and don't wish to ask directly, sometimes people are shy, right, and don't want to get up in front of a big crowd. We do have cards where you can write your questions for use at this meeting, so just ask Aaron about that. So those quick bios on Balaji and Jeff. Balaji Vaidyanathan is the manager of air permitting and compliance programs for ADEQ. He's been with ADEQ for 26 years and has managed air quality programs for 20 of those years. He has a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and a master's degree in industrial management. And then Jeff Christensen is a permit engineer in the air permits unit. He has been with the department for 4 years and has a total of 6 years of air quality permitting and compliance experience. He has a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and has the engineering training certification. So we would ask that you hold your questions until the end. I know there are going to be a lot of questions, but a lot of the questions that you have will probably be answered in this presentation. So we'll go ahead and turn the time over now to Balaji and Jeff. Go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Justin. Hey, thank you, Justin. I want to, on behalf of the team, extend a warm welcome to all of you to our community meeting. Community engagement is a very big part of what we do at ADEQ. Like, it gives us an opportunity for us to be here, talk to all of you regarding our reasoning behind our actions and how our actions impact your community. And, you know, with respect to this project, our subject matter experts, Jeff Christensen and Pima, have been doing some technical work for almost 2+ years now. So it's very exciting for us to be able to showcase the technical work and obviously feed your questions and respond to the best of our abilities. With respect to how the meeting will be run, I will obviously start off by giving a high-level overview of the project. And once I do that, I'll turn it over to Jeff for him to talk about the air permitting process. What did he do with the application? What kind of analysis goes into it? And once he's done with that, he'll turn it back to me, and I will talk about the whole compliance process, how it kind of comes together. Because when you talk about a permit, you know, you do it based on estimations and the application the company submitted. But eventually, we need to ensure that whatever we hold the company to can truly be enforced. So that's going to be the purpose of my portion of the slides at the end. And then once we get there, we will open it up for the Q&A session that Justin and Daniel talked about. And real quick, what this meeting is not about, I just want to clarify real quick, you know, this is all about the air permitting process. We're all air quality professionals. And you may have been part of the Aquifer Protection Permit public meeting and public hearing a few months ago. And that's an entirely separate team and a separate process. These two permits don't overlap. So if you do have any questions, we may not be in a position to respond to those. I just wanted to give you the context up front. So I'll start off with a very basic overview of the project. And I'll talk about jurisdiction, right? So generally speaking, when you have a mining project in Pima County, typically, ADEQ would not have oversight over air quality permitting. There is a local agency here. It's the Pima County Department of Environmental Quality. But I want to go back in time about 12 years ago when, based on a request from the company, ADEQ, following Arizona statutes, we asserted jurisdiction over what was called the Rosemont Copper Project back then. So based on that assertion of jurisdiction, we did a lot of technical work and we processed the permit back in 2013 for the Rosemont Copper Project. And we subsequently came back and renewed the permit 5 years later, one more time. And then fast forward to 2 years ago is when we started talking about the Copper World project with the company. And you know, the thinking behind what we're doing right now is we obviously have a lot of experience permitting in this region. And obviously the Copper World project sits in the same geographical footprint as the previous Rosemont Copper project. So we thought it would be well suited to execute the permitting for this project. So back in August of 2022 is when we asserted jurisdiction over the Copper World project. And ever since that time, me and my team have been working on the permit along with the company. Super high level kind of a schematic, an image for you. This project is about 28 miles southeast of the Tucson area, and it's nestled in the Santa Rita Mountains. And this project will straddle both the east side and the west side of the centimeter arms. And zooming in just a little bit into the location, I want to highlight a few things. In the picture, you will see 5 different open pit mines. So essentially the bigger project is made of 5 different mines. You will see something called beach engine. That's where the mining will start, and then they will work from there on to the remaining mines, which are heavyweight. There is copper work pit, there is rock top, butte, and then there is the Rosemont project as well. So there are these 5 different mines which they will mine, and whatever is mined is then processed through what is called an ore processing operation. There's crushing, there's something called froth flotation, and Jeff will get into a lot of detail about what exactly happens in that processing circuit. And then I also want to kind of show to you the tailings operation. You'll see the F block in the image, and that is the main tailings location. And tailings are essentially what we call spent refuse from the copper ore process. And essentially, the tailings ponds are where the tailings are placed, compacted, and maintained. And you see another small tailings operation down below, right by the heap leach pad. So there are 2 different operations in somewhat close proximity. With that said, I'm going to turn over right now to Jeff Christensen. He's going to talk a lot more about the whole process, all the sequential things that happen with the process, and also the considerations that he went through to process the air quality permit. Jeff?
So good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Christensen. As Balaji said, I am the engineer who was assigned to work on the permit application for the proposed Copper World project. What I'm going to do today is talk you through some of the proposed operations of the Copper World project, then talk through ADEQ's permitting program and kind of where the Copper World project fits into all of this. So the first step in the mining process is going to be actually getting the material out of the ground and transporting it to your processing facility or waste rock storage facility. So the first step will be drilling holes into the ore body and loading these holes with a blast media, typically a mixture of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. This charge is detonated and the fragmented material from that ore body is loaded into haul trucks. The ore will be transported to a ore processing facility on the west side of the mountain, while the big waste rock from the facilities will actually be transported to some of the older pits to really backfill those pits and not make like a huge hole in the mountain. So the first process we'll talk about is oxide ore processing, which is copper ore that contains a copper mineral that's bonded to an oxygen molecule. In this case, the mineral is leached from the ore, so to make that ore available for leaching, the ore goes through a crushing process to increase the surface area exposed for the ore. From there, it's conveyed to a heap leach pad, which is essentially just a pile of that crushed ore that gets irrigated by a sulfuric acid solution. And that sulfuric acid solution leaches out the copper and produces a substance known as pregnant leach solution. So that's just a solution of sulfuric acid which contains those copper ions inside of it. That solution is pumped to a solvent extraction facility which purifies that pregnant leach solution so that it really only contains copper. It doesn't contain some of the deleterious materials that might still be in there. That solution is then pumped to what's known as an electrowinning tank house, where they're pumped into electrowinning cells, and in the presence of a stainless steel blank, a current is introduced, which allows that copper to plate out onto that stainless steel blank. Once that process is completed, those blanks are removed from the process, and they peel off those cathodes for the final product of the copper processing operation. And one thing that's really unique about the Copper World project compared to a lot of the other copper mines in Arizona is that they're actually going to implement air pollution control systems on the electrowinning tank house. Typically, they have natural ventilation. In the case of the Copper World project, they're actually proposing to use scrubbers to basically vacuum any emissions from this facility and run it through a control system to minimize any emissions that might result from it. So the next process we'll talk about here is sulfide ore processing. This is copper ore that's bonded to a sulfur molecule. Unlike oxide ore, this isn't possible to go through a leaching process due to the chemistry of the reaction. So it typically goes through a mechanical liberation process. What they do is convert the larger ore into a fine sandy slurry in the crushing and milling process. and from there, that slurry is conveyed to a flotation cell. And that flotation cell will introduce chemicals which will make the copper molecules in there hydrophilic. And what that means is that they don't want to be in contact with the water in the slurry. So by injecting air into that flotation cell, they separate out those hydrophilic molecules, copper minerals, and they float up to the top of the cell, overflowing from that cell and are captured as a concentrate. Well, that remaining material in the flotation cell is what's known as tailings, and that's actually shipped to and pumped over to the tailings storage facility for processing. So typically, a copper mine's final product is going to be a copper concentrate. They'll dry it out and ship it out to a smelter for processing. In the case of the copper roll project, they're planning to actually produce the cathode final product on site. So they'll be using what's known as a concentrate bath aging process. They'll take the concentrate that's produced in the flotation process and mill it even finer so that the chemicals have even more access to the sulfur inside of the ore. So in this case, we're only going to be using sulfuric acid, and that will oxidize it'll oxidize the sulfide ore solute concentrate in there. And that'll produce what's called the same pregnant leach solution that we talked about for oxide ore. So they're able to process that through the solvent extraction and electrowinning process and really produce the final product of copper cathode as opposed to sending it over to a smelter where they'll smelt it into anode copper and then send it to another refinery to turn that into the final cathode copper. So it kind of bypasses a lot of potential emissions that might be associated with the copper processing operation. So another component of this operation is precious metals and sulfur recovery. From that concentrate bath aging, there will still be some metals such as gold and silver left in there, so the plan for the copper roll project is to recover those as valuable product and also recover some of the sulfur so that they don't have to truck it in and they're able to produce on site. So another mineral that commonly occurs with copper is called molybdenum, and it goes through the same process as sulfide ore does. It goes through crushing and milling process to size that ore into a fine sand material. It goes through another flotation cell, a very similar process. It's introducing chemicals that make it hydrophilic that allow that molybdenum to separate out. Where it differs a little bit is that there's a dewatering process where they basically separate the water by gravity from that concentrate and then send it to a dryer so that they actually get as much water as possible out of it so that they can send it to ship it out as a product. And again, the molybdenum process will also produce tailings because it's occurring at the same time as the copper process. So we've talked a little bit about tailings. That is the mine waste from the facility after the copper has been extracted from the copper sulfide ore that's transported to the facility. That will typically be dewatered, so that's similar to the process previously discussed for molybdenum. Gravity will help separate the actual slurry from the water. Water will be pumped back into the process while the remaining slurry is pumped to a cyclone, which separates out some of the heavier materials from the finer materials, with the heavier materials being used for the actual construction of the tailings embankment versus the finer materials just kind of flowing to be stored indefinitely into the tailings storage facility. So some of the supporting processes at the proposed copper roll project include a sulfuric acid plant, which would provide all of the sulfuric acid for any leaching operations at the facility. Emergency internal combustion engines, which will provide power for any emergency power outages, as well as fire water in case there's any fire at the primary pressures. Storage tanks will be on site storing gasoline and diesel fuel, as well as any processed chemicals, and mobile vehicles such as delivery trucks will help support the operation. So that's a lot of information. I give you guys a second to kind of take all of that in, but from here we're going to talk a little about ADEQ's air quality program and where the copper roll project kind of fits into everything. So we'll start by talking about what our permitting process looks like. We typically will start with a pre-application meeting, which will be an opportunity for the company to discuss technical topics with us, emission calculations, modeling topics, any permitting topics. If they need to get an idea of what our permitting timeline will typically look like, that'll be an opportunity to do that. After that's been completed, people will submit the company will submit a permit application for us, and ADEQ will commence their review at that point. So in the case of the copper roll project, ADEQ spent approximately 2 years of going back and forth with emissions calculations, modeling topics, permitting topics, a lot of back and forth before we were able to get the permit to a point where we were comfortable with moving forward with public notice. So from there, we drafted the permit and drafted technical report document, which is basically analysis of the ADEQ's review of the application for the public to understand. And we continued, from there we did some informal engagement with the Pima County Department of Environmental Quality, their permitting program, as well as some of the interested tribal nations in the area, such as the Tohono O'odham, Pascagoula, Yaqui, and Hopi tribes. After those engagement opportunities were completed, we commenced public notice on July 15, 2024, and scheduled this community engagement meeting to get out in the community and give you guys a good opportunity to ask us any questions that you had while reviewing this, and maybe come up with some new questions to submit to us after this. So I do want to remind you guys, we'll be holding a public hearing at this location on September 10th, 6 p.m. We would love to have everybody that's here there. The public participation period will conclude on September 15th, so we want to give you guys a couple of extra days to, take any comments that were submitted at the public hearing, noodle on them, and if you have anything additional, you have that opportunity to come back to us, as opposed to, we might typically close the public participation period on that public hearing day, and if you come up with something, maybe you might not have that opportunity to get back to us. So once we receive all of the comments in the public hearing, participation period closes on September 15th. The ADEQ will review all comments and draft a response to the summary, and that will be provided to every person that comments on this permit with the final agency action. So a little bit of information about ADEQ's air quality permitting program. We really have two key roles in air quality permitting program. The first being to develop permits that compile all the applicable state, federal, and local regulations that might apply to an operation. The next part is to ensure that new and occasionally modified facilities are not going to result in emissions that will interfere with attainment of what's known as the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. We'll talk about those in a little bit, but how this is evaluated is through a topic known as air dispersion modeling, where Dr. Fong Mao is kind of our expert on that, and I'll go into detail about what goes into that and also ADEQ's review of the modeling report submitted to us in just a moment. So I mentioned the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, but you might wonder what they are. These are federal health-based standards developed by the EPA, which are intended to be protected with public sensitive populations. And that will include children, elderly, people with respiratory illnesses such as asthma. So what are the max pollutants? There are 6, technically 7, particulate matter is split between coarse particulate matter known as PM10, which is typically associated with construction dust. Well, you'll see PM2.5 is fine particulate matter, and that's typically associated more with combustion processes and high temperature processes like smelting, although there will be a fine fraction of PM2.5 resulting from construction dust as well. So on the right here, you can see an image of the human hair in comparison with PM2.5 and PM10. What you should take away from that is this is really not visible particulate matter. If you see a piece of hair floating in the air, it's probably not visible to you, and these are even smaller than that. So the measurement scale for this, the scale of what we're looking at here is quite small. So the pollutants we're dealing with here are particulate matter, ozone, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and lead. In the case of the Copper World project, the primary pollutants of concern is particulate matter. So on this screen, you'll see each of the primary National Ambient Air Quality Standards for each pollutant. And I apologize if it's a little bit small. I see some people streaming to see that, so we'll try to make this all available for everybody afterwards as well. But in essence, each pollutant will have its own averaging period and primary National Ambient Air Quality Standard, which is intended to be protected in public health. So for example, if the PM10 concentrations measured by a monitor over a 24-hour period exceed 150 micrograms per cubic meter, that monitor might report an exceedance of that standard. And that may, if this is a frequent occurrence or if this is a result of an exceptional event, it may result in non-attainment for an area, which will result in additional requirements for any of the permitted facilities in the area. And one thing I do want to note at the bottom here is hazardous air pollutants. This is a concept that's outside of the typical modeling domain. There is no National Ambient Air Quality Standard that's been developed for any of the hazardous air pollutants. EPA hasn't developed any standards for us to compare against, so we really have limited ability to compare there. If we do, it's typically more for informational purposes. So you might ask yourself, when is a facility required to obtain a permit with ADEQ? So whether you need a permit, what type of permit you require, it's typically going to be reliant on the facility's potential to emit. The potential to emit is the facility's annual emissions, assuming 24/7, 365 operation of the facility at maximum operating capacity, assuming compliance with all legally enforceable permit requirements. So one thing that's important to note for copper mines is that fugitive emissions are not part of the potential to emit. So these might be sources like haul roads and wind erosion from town facilities. The Clean Air Act does not include this as part of the potential to emit for a copper mine. Where we'll eventually evaluate the potential to emit for these facilities is going to be more in the ore processing operations and the control devices that control those operations in the case of the copper project. That doesn't count for fugitive emissions, however, so any metals emitted from any wind erosion or haul roads, that is included in their determination for what type of permit they will need. So you might ask yourself, what are fugitive and what are non-fugitive emissions? In general, non-fugitive emissions will be ore processing operations, the sulfuric acid plant, internal combustion engines, stuff that actually goes through stacking. At the bottom, you'll see the legal definition for what fugitive emissions are. And in that sense, it's really something that can't be enclosed and vented to a single point. So examples of that might be haul roads, wind erosion from large tailing facilities, large storage piles, drilling, explosive blasting, examples like that. And one thing that's important to note is while these aren't qualified for potential to emit, that doesn't mean they're completely ignored. They're a very important component of air dispersion modeling. It's all quantified for us. The permit will contain stringent requirements for any fugitive emissions that result from this operation. So we don't just, push them aside and ignore them and not think about them at all after we quantify them. So here we'll talk a little bit about ADEQ's permitting thresholds. In the left column here, you'll see the Copper World project's potential to emit. The first column is what's the minor resource review threshold, or the permitting exemption threshold. These are the thresholds where a facility will A, be required to obtain some kind of permit with ADEQ, and B, they may be required to demonstrate that the facility's emissions will not impact attainment of the national ambient air quality standards. So in the case of the Copper World project, you'll see that they exceeded the permitting exemption or minor resource review thresholds for PM10, PM2.5, and nitrogen oxides. The next column over is the Class 2 permit threshold, also known as the significant threshold, and they're essentially double the permitting exemption thresholds. So if you'll see below for the Class 2 threshold, you'll see that the Copper World project exceeds for particulate matter PM10 and PM2.5. The next column over, we'll talk about Class 1 or Title 5 permits. For each of these pollutants, the threshold is going to be 100 tons per year from ore processing operations, except for hazardous air pollutants, which have a threshold of 10 tons per year for any individual hazardous air pollutant, and 25 tons per year for cumulative, as in all hazardous air pollutants that might be emitted from the facility. And again, like I mentioned previously, this will include any fugitive emissions from the facility. So here we'll take a look at the potential to emit for the Copper World project next to the fugitive emissions. As I mentioned, the fugitive emissions for the Copper World project is quantified are quite high, but that does not mean they're something we ignore. As I mentioned, they're a key component of air dispersion modeling, and they are subject to very stringent requirements for dust control and tailings management in their air quality equipment. So like I mentioned, these fugitive emissions are not part of potential to emit in determining what type of permit is required, but they are a huge component of determining whether or not this facilities and operations will result in concentrations exceeding the national ambient air quality standards, which ADEQ would interpret to be impacting public health. So you might ask yourself what the difference between a Class 1 and a Class 2 permit is. Operationally, there really isn't a large difference between a Class 1 and a Class 2 permit. They're a compilation of the applicable requirements. Where they'll differ a lot is in the processing of the application. So for a Class 1 application, there's a 45-day EPA review period where the EPA has the opportunity to comment or, in extreme cases, object to issuance of an air quality permit. Class 1 permits are also subject to a notification of affected states. So if this facility is within 50 miles of the state border, it may impact that state's airshed. So when public notice begins, we will notify that state and give them the opportunity to comment on the permit. Emissions inventories are submitted on an annual basis for Class 1 permits. An emissions inventory is basically an evaluation of the facility's emissions on an annual basis. So Class 1 or Class 2 permits are typically only required every 3 years. The ADEQ does have the discretion to require them to submit annually, and I imagine we will exercise that discretion on the larger projects like this. Another key difference is Class 1 permits are subject to an emissions-based fees resulting from that emissions inventory, while Class 2 permits are not subject to that requirement. Class 1 permits do have a semi-annual compliance certification where they essentially submit a certification to ADEQ notifying us that they've complied with all requirements of their permit or identifying conditions in their permit where they had intermittent compliance and what went into correcting those issues. Class 2 permits typically only will be required to submit on an annual basis, but for the Copper World project, we are requiring them to submit on a semi-annual basis. So I talked a little bit about mining resource review and demonstrating attainment with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And that's really where the mining resource review program stands. It has two main components. There's a control technology review. So a facility will be required to identify opportunities to install what's known as reasonably available control technology for any operations that are subject to the mining resource review program. And on top of that, there's what's known as a max attainment designation. So they'll be required to conduct an ambient air impact analysis using air dispersion modeling programs to show that emissions from this facility will not result in emissions in air quality concentrations that exceed the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So what is air dispersion modeling? EPA developed a tool known as AirMod, which is the gold standard for air dispersion modeling and permitting topics. It's essentially a mathematical simulation of the dispersion of air pollutants to evaluate the impact of those pollutants against national ambient air quality standards. And this takes in data such as emissions data, and that might be the type of emission source, the emission rate, what release height of the pollutants is. It'll combine that with meteorological data, so wind speed, wind direction, temperature, as well as topography, so what the local terrain is like, what the land use in the area is like. And all of that information is combined in the AirMod model to produce a modeled concentration. That modeled concentration is summed with the background concentration from regulatory monitors that is deemed to be representative or conservative for the impacted areas. And those background concentrations are summed with that modeled concentration to evaluate against the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. If ADEQ determines that the National Ambient Air Quality Standards in any area accessible to the public, which is typically going to be the fence line of the facility, will be exceeded, we cannot issue that permit. So what does an air dispersion model look like? Receptors are what actually read the model concentration in the AirMod program. So they're placed in all areas accessible to the public. In the case of the Copper World project, there is a portion of the Santa Rita elevation road that runs through the project that will still be considered publicly accessible. So we did require them to put receptors on this as well, even though it's very unlikely that somebody would be there for a 24-hour period. The receptor network will cover a 10-kilometer, 6-mile range from the Copper World project. One thing I do want to note with the model is that we didn't observe that the highest concentrations occurred near the boundary of the property. And the reason for this is that a lot of the sources at the Copper World project have very low release heights as opposed to a tall stack, which allows the fluids to travel a further distance while dispersing through that air. So for the Copper World project, ADEQ required multiple model scenarios due to the large and continuously changing footprint of the facility. Year 2 was identified by ADEQ as a year that has a reasonably high throughput while all operations are taking in place on the west side of the mountain and a reasonably small footprint. Year 8 was identified by ADEQ as the worst case scenario. This is the scenario where they have the maximum out-of-pit hauling emissions, which is what ADEQ determined to be the primary contributor to whether or not this facility was compliant with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Year 14 is continuing on that. We looked at both the maximum total in-pit and out-of-pit hauling emissions associated with haul trucks, because again, these were the primary contributors to the model concentrations for NACS pollutants. So again, due to the large footprint encompassing in both sides of the Santa Rita Mountain, ADEQ also required additional modeling scenarios focusing on the meteorological data, because one side of the mountain will have a very distinctive meteorological pattern compared to the other side, especially when it comes to wind speeds and directions. So data for the west side of the mountain was collected on-site adjacent to their proposed processing facility for a year, while historical data from the previous Rosemont Copper project was used to model impacts on the east side of the facility. So I talked a little bit about background concentrations, and here's a table where we sourced each of them for each pollutant. For PM10, for the west side of the mountain, we utilized the current day Sun monitor, which is just north of the processing facility. For the east side of the mountain, we used previously collected data for the Rosemont Copper project. For PM 2.5, where it's expected to have a more uniform concentration over space, we utilized the Saguaro National Park East monitor, which is just north of the Tucson area, and is impacted a bit more by some of the urban sources that may not impact the Copper World project. From here, we'll talk about nitrogen dioxide, which used historical data from the Alamo Lake State Park NO2 monitor, and sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide, which used data from the Tucson Children's Memorial Park, which is again exposed to urban sources of pollution that the Copper World project will likely not be. So on the screen, we'll take a look at the model results for year 8. Again, this is what ADEQ identified as the worst case scenario for the Copper World project. You will see in the background concentration column for PM10 that they use a monthly background concentration. So each month they use the maximum 24-hour concentration for that month and directly input those into AirMod to determine the total model concentration, which is inclusive of background concentration. For other pollutants, the modeled concentrations are modeled directly and then summed with the background concentration in the next column to get the total model index. So what you'll see is that PM10 and PM 2.5, again, the primary pollutants of concern from this facility, are relatively close to max compared to, or approaching certainly. But one thing again I do want to note is that there is a very steep drop off in concentrations, which we will show you guys in just a couple slides here, with distance, again, due to the low release heights of the sources in this area, or in the proposed for the Copper World project. So here we'll take a look at the year 8 modeling results for the east side of the Santa Rita Mountains. Again, in this case, we'll see there's a little bit more buffer for PM10 and PM 2.5 compared to the west side of the mountain, and other pollutants have a fair amount of buffer space between them. So to help you guys visualize the impacts from the facility, we've developed what's known as a contour plot. This is for the 24-hour PM10 concentrations. So what this will depict is the maximum concentration for a 24-hour period for each receptor that's modeled in this area. Any areas that are outside of the shaded area are assumed to be at or very close to background concentrations. Areas in the blue are minor impacts, while we'll see that the red areas are where we see maximum modeled concentrations. And in the case of the Copper World project, again, you'll see it really close to the ridge line, and you'll see it in the adjacent to the processing facility, where actually the maximum concentrations take place on that Santa Rita road receptors that we require them to put in, because people will still be able to travel on that road. And as you will see here, the impacts from the facility drops significantly as distance increases. So here we'll take a look at the annual PM 2.5 model, and this is utilizing an entire year of meteorological data to evaluate the emissions. So you'll see it's a little bit more focused. Again, this is because of the time scale. We're evaluating 24-hour versus an entire annual data set, so it's going to be a bit more focused. You'll see again that the elevated concentrations typically take place near the ridge line, also on the Santa Rita Road portion that crosses through the facility, with impacts steeply dropping off as distance increases. So I think a fair question to ask is, how did ADEQ ensure that a facility is operated consistent with how it is modeled? That's a very important topic for ADEQ, and a lot of work is put into ensuring that they're operating consistent with the assumptions that are made. So part of that will go into setting emissions limitations for the control equipment that they have on site and requiring stringent performance testing requirements so that they demonstrate with a third party overseen by ADEQ that they are able to comply with the emission limitations that have been permitted. There's the obligation to operate and maintain air pollution control equipment to minimize air pollutants resulting from operation of the facility. I mentioned performance testing, but there's also an obligation to require monitor operating parameters, which are indicative of the performance of that control device. So examples of that might be pressure drop for a dust collection system or scrubber flow rate for any solution going into the scrubber. Additional requirements are the development of a fugitive dust control plan and tailings management plan to ensure that they're taking at least adequate measures to control any emissions that result from those types of operations. And one unique thing with the Copperwell project is that we're also requiring ambient air quality monitoring adjacent to the processing facility in areas where we saw elevated model concentrations, so that we actually have real-time data to compare against our models, so that we can know it's valid, and so that we have data to compare against to know how well they're implementing some of these fugitive emission plans, which we believe are really the big impactors of whether this facility is able to comply with national ambient air quality standards. But thank you all so much for your time. I really appreciate you guys being a kind audience. I know that was a lot of technical information, and it might have been, a lot. I hope I answered any questions that you guys had, but if you guys had more that came up from this, we're happy to answer them as they come up after I give Apology the opportunity to talk a little about the specific requirements that'll be in the permit and the ADEQ's role in it. So thank you, everybody.
So like I mentioned before, one of the things that I want to do right now is we're going to talk about some of the key concepts we built into the air quality permit, and also how our compliance program will eventually enforce the permit conditions. But before I go there, I want to maybe summarize some key takeaways from Jeff's presentation. There's a lot of extensive technical materials. I want to summarize it high level. One of the key concepts he talked about is the kind of permit the company is getting, right? So when we talk about a copper mine, we establish the concept that it is a source category where a certain type of emissions, called fugitive emissions, when you talk about criteria pollutants, cannot be counted, right? So based on that concept, and that's a consistent concept between federal, state, and county law. Based on that concept and looking at the emissions that Jeff showed, the company qualifies for what we call a minor source class 2 permit. Right? That's the first takeaway that I want to convey. The second thing is the fact that we talked about what is called minor new source review and air dispersion modeling. So when we talk about minor new source review and NAAQS compliance, that is a huge building block in the permit. Right? We got to be able to establish that the ambient impacts from the projects are below levels where the federal standards are established, so that we have confidence the public health is being suitably protected. Right? So that's a big criteria. And the way we went about it between Jeff's work and Dr. Feng Mao's work is we applied EPA, the gold standard tool, EDMAR, in a very rigorous fashion, worked extensively with the company and their consultants to ensure that the model is being applied the right way, and truly when you take the facilities impacts along with a representative background attached to it, the impacts are safe and below the max. So that we talked about that a lot, so that's a key takeaway. And the last thing is, and he touched on it briefly, and I'm going to expand on it, is really what makes up a permit, right? Because, a lot of the work that we do at the beginning of the process is evaluating emissions, evaluating impacts, and then you need to make all this stuff come together in the permit, right? However, it's easily readable for the permittee to be able to comply with it, and also from our standpoint, when our inspectors show up to the site, are they able to look at a permit, look at the operation, and make meaningful conclusions that a facility is truly in compliance or not in compliance? So with that said, I'll pull up this table real quick. And again, I don't know if you can read all of what is in there, and I'm not going to read through this line by line, but the key concept that we're trying to convey is we just don't accept assumptions that a company makes at face value and give a permit. There's a lot more that goes on, right? The evaluation happens, we need to be comfortable that the assumptions are reliable, and once they are reliable, we are able to build them into the permit and make them truly the long haul, right? One of the first things that I want to point out is the very first row. It talks about mining rate, and the facility has accepted a limit of 200,000 tons per day. And this is a key concept, right? When we talk about emissions and keeping them at a mine source level, those emissions are fundamentally driven by like a process rate. So when we are able to evaluate the application and find out that the application calculations are driven by a certain process rate, we take that number, we apply to the permit, and we make them comply with it. When our inspectors, people like Rob, show up on the plan, they're able to look at the plan records and ensure that the number is truly being complied with. Okay? And then I want to focus your attention at the very bottom of the table. We talk about two different plans. One of them is called the Fugitive Dust Control Plan. The other is called the Tailings Management Plan. And I'll get into more detail with these plans in a couple of slides. But the thing that I want to convey, again, to reinforce this idea, even though we do not count the fugitive emissions of the dust as part of the facility's type, it is a very important concept in the actual model. And by looking at the modeling runs, we were able to establish that the impacts, like Jeff said, are compliant at the fence line. And as you get past the fence line, the impacts start tapering rather dramatically with distance, right? So what that tells us is a lot of the impacts, the way they work in the model, are driven by low-level sources, ground-level sources. Jeff talked about that. The roads are important. The tailings areas are important. Open areas and storage piles are important, right? So we focus a lot of attention on those areas. And the way we do it with some of our more modern mining permits is to build these dust control plans, right? So these are very, very prescriptive plans, and we made these plans available as part of the public comment process. It gives you a lot of rigor around how they need to be vigilant around these areas, what they need to do from a control standpoint, and how they need to monitor emissions from these activities. The next thing that I want to talk about is the fact that the company relies on a lot of air pollution control equipment, and that's a good thing, right? So when we talk about these fairly big-sized mining equipment, we're talking about some rather significant emissions. But when you add on extensive controls on top of them, you're going to achieve a significant level of pollution control, right? And that is the representation that the company makes as part of the application. We accept it, but we have to be vigilant about enforcing it. So that's where our permitting concepts come in. So I'll pick maybe the first couple of those, right? We talk about a couple of different control devices. One of them is a regular dust collector like a bag house. The other is what's called a wet scrubber, right? So when these are in the permit, there is an expectation that these controls are run correctly in line with vendor certifications, right? The vendor prescribes you got to be at a certain operating range, and we ensure that. So there is a requirement in the permit that these parameters need to be looked at by the facility on a very periodic basis. And should they deviate from these operating ranges prescribed by the vendor, the expectation is they do whatever that needs to be done to get them back within the range that is prescribed. So that is how we ensure on a short-term basis that the control devices are operating optimally. That being said, we still need the ultimate verification of compliance, right? When companies make projections based on control equipment that they're going to be emitting at a certain mass rate, that mass rate actually goes into the permit. It goes in a different form, we call it grade loading limit, that goes in the permit, but then you got to test it. And the way the testing is done is by following very rigorous EPA testing protocols. The federal government establishes it, and typically the company will bring on some experts. They'll bring a third-party testing company to do the testing, and typically we will send our stack test inspector to supervise the test. So this is a rigorous process that they go through, and this is how they formally demonstrate compliance. And it's not a one-time test. They have to test multiple times in the permit term to show on an ongoing basis that they're truly being compliant. I'm going to go on to the next slide and talk a little bit more about the two plans I mentioned before, the Fugitive Dust Control Plan and the Tailings Management Plan, and just kind of elaborate a little bit more on what they stipulate. One of the things we look out for is visible emissions, right? Is there a dust plume being kicked up, right? So we want the company personnel to be out there on a regular basis, following time-tested EPA protocols to make measurements, right, as to what is really coming off the ground, right? And there is a standard that they got to comply with. So we want them to be vigilant about that process. What we also want them to be very good about is physically inspecting these roads and these tailings, right? Because what we are looking out for, and our inspectors will do the same thing, how does the integrity of the road being held up? You know, if you're applying some kind of a chemical suppression technique to keep the dust down, how is the chemical holding up? Is there physical cracks in the road segment, or is the integrity clean, right? That's the whole point of it. And the expectation is, by virtue of this ongoing upkeep, they're able to more swiftly look at any problems, identify them, and repair the places where there may be a lack of integrity. Right? So that's something that we put the burden on them, as well as our inspectors that they show up. Other things that we expect, you know, a very key concept that we built in is an annual review of the plan. You know, our best plans when we process a permit is what comes through in our interactions with the company and how we put together a dust control plan or a tailings management plan. But by no means do we believe that the plans are perfect. They are done based on our extensive experience and how we work with the company. But as they operate the mine and we have live data, and our inspectors take a look at what is being done on the property, and we look at the records that they maintain with respect to how much water they applied, how much chemical they applied on the roads and the tailings, it allows us to course correct a little bit, right? So the idea is to stay nimble and organic. Every year, we will work with them on a full-blown effectiveness study to ensure that the plan that is being implemented is really the best plan we can put out there. And if there's an opportunity for us to organically improve the plan, that's exactly what we do every single year. So the next item, Jeff talked about this a little bit, right? So a lot of our work leading up to permit writing is driven by the computer model. It is the EPA gold standard. We rely on it heavily. Every agency across the country probably relies on it. But that being said, it is still a mathematical simulation, right? What we have done with modern permits, and we've done this even before the Rosemont permit, and they do it here, is to require the company to install, maintain, and operate an ambient monitoring station. What that really means is, instead of the computer model that gave us the results before, now we truly have a measure of their real-world impacts. So we are able to see on a very regular basis how they are performing relative to how the computer model showed them as what the impacts would be, right? So it gives us an extremely good level of validation. And should there be problematic readings that we see, they're also required to run a met station. And what that means is they're able to measure wind speeds, wind directions in the general area. So it gives us a good feel for, okay, we see a problem, where exactly is the problem coming from? So that we can use it from a troubleshooting standpoint by working with the company, right? So this is how we try to build a permit, right? It is good to accept representation, but at the end of the day, we got to accept, but we got to verify their assumptions. That's what we do to the permitting process. Lastly, with respect to how the overall compliance program kind of comes together for us, I talked about this. We're going to have inspectors out there on a very regular basis, right? So all inspectors are going to be very well versed with the permit. They're going to be able to know exactly which areas of the facility are likely to be problematic, be able to go take a close look. And also, our inspections, very importantly, are unannounced. So we don't let the company know when they're showing up, right? It's completely unannounced. That way, we are able to see the plant, how they operate, whether we are there or we are not there. We're able to see them truly operate the way they normally do, right? That's a big part of it. The second thing is, complaint response. Should you observe something that they're operating, and should you be concerned that there's an environmental compliance issue, we urge you to contact us. We have multiple ways you can make contact with us. My business card is here, you can make direct contact with me. We have an inspection hotline number that you can call in and report. There's also a website option where you can put in your request, and should you choose to remain anonymous, we certainly can do that. But typically, we are very expedient. When we get a complaint, we are going to get people out there to take a close look at the problem, and if there's truly a problem, we are going to work with them very aggressively to remedy the problem and get them back into compliance. I talked about performance testing already. Again, when the companies are required to do these EPA protocol-driven tests, we are going to be out there. So it's not one of those things where they just get to do what they want to do and report the results. We are going to be out there supervising it. And then we are going to be out there reviewing the results that they submit to us, right? And also, apart from our presence being out there in the field and observing them, the companies are required to do some extensive amount of monitoring, and they are required to submit a lot of reports to us. And those reports are reviewed by a permitting staff, for example, Jeff. And should he see a troubling concept in the report, he's going to work with the compliance team to escalate it, and that may prompt a deeper investigation from our compliance team and possibly our inspectors making a trip to the facility. And lastly, there's also the component of emissions, excess emissions reporting. Should the facility observe a problem on their site, they're legally obligated to report to us, right? We have built an online portal which makes it particularly convenient for a facility to report what the incident is, and that typically will prompt a visit from us, right? So we try to be nimble in multiple ways. We can be there 24/7, but when we need to be there, we are good about getting there very quickly. And we are very, very good with our practices with enforcement. We have an agency-wide comprehensive handbook that we follow. Should there be acts of non-compliance where we can use either formal or informal remedies to bring them back into compliance. And the last piece is, Jeff touched on it, there is an emission inventory reporting component. On a periodic basis, the facility is required to report emissions, and obviously by looking at those reports, they can also find some anomalous trends if they exist, and we can investigate it further if we need to. So that essentially brings me to the end of my presentation. We hope that between what I shared and what Jeff shared, we gave you all some good context about the Copper World application process, our regulations, our permitting process, and quite frankly, what happens after the permit issue. When the rubber hits the road, how are we going to hold the company accountable? So that said, this slide right here has our contact information for myself, for Jeff, and our committee liaison, Aaron Hughes, and you can always contact us with any questions. With that said, I'm going to pass the baton back to Justin.
Wonderful, thank you, Balaji. So you all have been very, very patient, and we understand that this is technical information. It's a lot to wade through. We want to thank you for having patience with us and letting us get through this. We are going to go into our question and answer portion of our conversation now. Just a few things to level set on, and then we'll get started. We would prefer the questions remain about the presentation, or please ask questions regarding information about the air quality permit that we can consider towards the permitting process. If previous speakers asked a question, we prefer to hear new questions so we can consider those towards the permitting, and all questions have equal weight. Some of the questions you may have may not be answered tonight, but we will work to get consultation in conjunction with this permit, and we'll follow up with answers as needed. If there's a question we don't have an immediate answer to, we'll take that down and follow up with you. Also, we're asking that you keep your questions to about 3 minutes, and we'll give short reminders on those, or on that 3 minutes. So if we can, here's the way we're going to do this. We have people that signed up with Aaron at the front here as they came in. So he has a list of people. What we're going to do is we're going to have 3 people at a time on deck. He'll let you know who those people are. And if you can come up, and I'll just hold the mic and you can make your question. If you want to stay up here for any follow-up questions, that's okay. And then Balaji and Jeff and some of our other colleagues, potentially Daniel, will help out with those questions. So Aaron, why don't we get started with the first folks that are going here?
So first we have Jonathan Paul Salvatierra. He wants to speak about water and air pollution potential. Then we have Kathy McGrath. She wants to speak about the air permit. And then Sala Bennett wants to speak about the fugitive emissions.
Okay, so first was Paul.
John Paul.
John Paul, I'm so sorry. John, is it John or Paul?
Jonathan.
Oh, Jonathan, okay, come on up, John.
I'd like to go ahead and use this mic. My primary concern, being a railroader, retired railroader, was the exposure I have witnessed and experienced. The first portion, and I understand the modeling is modeling, it's not true line factoring. And it's all company created, it's not created by the actual reporting is done by the company, but yet there are guidelines that there's a difference between, I guess, the permit number 2 and the permit number 1, and the stringency and the timeliness that this reporting is done. So my major concern is that you're identifying who will the fault protect, the corporate reporting or the people that are being affected by these changes, and how, if a permit is issued, shouldn't it rely and protect the public more in the long run than the corporate reporting? Because there are times when the fault may not be identified. If in a permit number 2, it might not be identified until a year later and resolved. In a permit number 1, it's more timely, but it's only half that time, every 6 months. And so that condition may exist for that 6 month or that 1 year period, and it's very distressing to me. So I want some clarification on, is it the direction of the ADEQ that it's a failure if you can't issue a permit? It's identified that one has never not issued a permit. And that's kind of baffling to me. So it tells me that maybe we're not protecting the public as much as we're protecting the right to issue the permit. And that's very dubious.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, for that question. So as I heard the question, it was, is this permit going to protect the corporation or is it going to protect the public? Did I get that right, Jonathan?
Yes.
Basically, okay. Who wants to take it, Daniel?
Thank you for the question. The permit is protective of public health and the environment. So it protects everyone. It is designed to be protective of public health and the environment. The company has to follow the permit requirements. It's a contract between ADEQ and the permittee on what they're going to do to operate that plant.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I think the next person was Kathy. Was that who we had? Kathy? Oh, come on up, Kathy.
So I want to use this map.
Sure, absolutely.
I
Can
want
I hold it for
to.
you?
You can.
Yeah, where do you want it put?
I want them to see it too.
That's not, I don't want it. Oh, you want them to see also? I don't know if you have to crowd and them to see it. Yeah, that's fine. I'll go back. So, go ahead.
You're not being a very good banner.
I'm not being a very good banner.
No.
I'm not a good banner. I'm a guy. That's probably why. All right, I'll keep it.
I gotta see it.
Okay.
Start this way,
Okay.
they'll know more. No, just stand straight.
Okay.
All right, come on, man. Just so you kind of know where this is, I was hoping to have a big F map up here. This is the very top of HUD base F. And this is the elongated U that I live next to. So my question is, On the 2022 PEA, which was, the report came out before the application to the permit was done in October. And also in the 2023 PFS, there are mentions of 3 storage tailing areas, TSF 1, 2, and N. This is TSF N, the F is 1, and then below that is 2. My question is, this is a map that's showing slightly north of what you normally see, and this is a 1,000 home subdivision. This is a 96 home residential area, lots, and my house is 300 feet from the tailings area, this TSFN. Why is it not in the permit?
Is that the question?
One question.
Okay.
Okay, 2.
Okay. Take that. Well,
Yeah.
great.
Good question. So, from what we understand, there have been some discussions from Copper World in some settings about this third phase operation. What you're talking about is not the F block. TSF, I don't know the name, but thank you. Thank you. The thing that I say is, as far as the air quality permit application goes, they only applied for these 2. The one that we showed in our slides, TSF, the F block, and the one below by the heat leach area, those are the only 2 things they applied for. But to answer your question, should there be a possibility for Copper World to consider the third operation, which you say is in close proximity to your property? They will need to come back to us and work with us, because it will be another permitting evaluation, because we need to figure out what kind of emissions are going to come from it, whether when you aggregate those emissions with what is previously being permitted and modeled, like when I talked about, the evaluation needs to happen all over again. So they don't get to add it if they want to down the road. The permit limits them only to build and operate what they applied for and what we are giving them a permit for. And as of now, the permit that you have written does not include the other tailings operation.
Okay, but it's there in their plans. It was in 2022 PEA and the 2023 PSF. My point is, by not putting this in, your emissions, the close emissions area is going to be down here, which is a lot further from the subdivision. There's an elementary school right here that's 1.5 miles, and this subdivision is 1 mile. Would it not have triggered a class 1 if you were looking at emissions all over here?
Again, a good question, right? So I answered it in 2 parts. One, fundamentally, they can do it till they come back to us and get the right permit to include that operation, which they have not done so far. I can't talk to Copper World's thinking on this, but all I can tell you is what they applied for and what we are permitting. To answer the second question about the class 1 versus class 2, the tailings area, like Jeff talked about, is what we call a fugitive emission source. So even to the extent that they add that new tailings area to their operations, those emissions will not count towards whether they are classified to be a class 1 or a class 2. If you remember, fugitive emissions for a copper mine are not included as part of the evaluation to figure out the type of permit. But that being said, if they do add it eventually, they will have to run the whole air dispersion model all over again, including the tailings,
Okay,
the
so
new tailings.
if you give them a class 2, and they start operating and everything's going on, but then they do this and it ends up needing a class 1, you can't just change the class, you have to revoke and reissue?
No, you won't revoke. What happens is, we can reissue the permit as a class 1 permit. Of course, they need to meet all the requirements to get the permit. But what I'm trying to tell you is, if this happens, those emissions will very likely be all fugitive. And what I'm trying to explain is, those fugitive emissions are not part of the evaluation for class 2 versus class 1. Okay? But they will be modeled. So from a public health protection standpoint, which you seem to be very concerned about, because if this is going to be a few hundred yards from where you live at, you have good reason to be concerned, and that will be addressed, because they have to do modeling. they have to convince us that the new tailings, along with everything that they had before, would have to comply with the rest.
300 feet away, they have to
So,
make sure.
Kathy, did you have a second question?
Well, that was it, right?
Okay.
My question about the class 2 to class 1. And the last part of that would be, if they did ask for an amendment, would it be a significant amendment that would require open comment again?
That's a really good question. It's going to depend upon the review that we do. And that is something that I'm going to keep in mind from this conversation, right? So,
Y'all saw that, right? Yeah.
absolutely. I acknowledge your
Want
point.
to get us a copy, pass it on to me. Pass it on. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kathy. Okay, so I am forgetting now the what was our third name there? Saba? Saba, I'm so sorry, Saba.
It happens all the time.
Great, you're used to it a little bit. Come on up here,
It's
Saba.
fine. So, see if you can hear me here. And again, this is again about fugitive emissions. I watched the presentation, and I'm even more confused now than I was before researching this last night. So, why did ADEQ categorize ore processing as fugitive emission sources? Now it seems to me that you're saying that they didn't. But I'm confused because according to the Clean Air Act, fugitive emissions are emissions that, quote, can't be reasonably prevented, end quote. In fact, this is important because fugitive emissions are not included in the total calculation for emissions in the application. So HUD Bay looks real good here, right? So the activities that normally are considered fugitive include road traffic, like you said, blasting, because these are open air activities, you can't really contain these. But during ore processing, there are many ways to prevent emissions, such as using maybe covered conveyor belts, building containment structures where processing takes place. So why are HUD-based ore processing activities considered to be sources of unpreventable emissions?
Yeah, I can take that, and that's a great question, and I would be asking the same question in your position. So a little bit of background on the emissions calculations for the Copper World project. All of the emission sources for ore processing are ventilated to dust collection equipment, and each of these dust collection equipment have a current loading limit in the permit which the facility will require to conduct performance testing for. So I think what you're referring to is the 99% pickup efficiency that they reference for a lot of those control devices. And I don't think it would be unreasonable to count those as non-fugitive emissions. In fact, I think going back, we should probably have included those as non-fugitive emissions from the total potential to emit. One thing I do want to note is that it is common practice for copper mines in Arizona, such as the larger Freeport mines, to actually not even consider fugitive emissions from processes that are controlled by dust collectors, because these are enclosed and they are ventilated with ventilation pits which are sucking up the air from inside of that process and passing that air through fabric filters, which EPA has shown, even dating back to the 90s, can achieve 99+% control efficiency for PM10 and PM2.5. So that's kind of the background for that, but I do agree that the pickup efficiency could have been evaluated as non-fugitive emissions for potential to emit. One thing I do want to kind of follow up with that is we have looked into that, as some of the comments that we received from you guys during the public participation period, and including those ore processing fugitives, quote unquote, as non-fugitive emissions, it still results in them being below the 100 ton per year threshold. And because most of our copper mines would not include those emissions in their emissions calculations, because those were still modeled, I felt that it was reasonably conservative to not push them to take those. I would rather them have modeled those emissions than to take them out completely, because I feel like that's more conservative and a more conservative evaluation of the impacts on public health. So I agree. I think that we could reclassify those operations as non-fugitive and present those numbers to the public in a responsible summary. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Really appreciate that. All right, Aaron, who is next on the three?
So first we have Linda Bayless for air emissions. Next, Nancy Kowalski for PM10 and wind events. And then next, David DeGroot, wind direction and air quality.
Okay, Linda, go ahead.
My concern is how well you can trust the monitoring. It is my understanding that there's a certain degree of monitoring and the installation of equipment that's up to HUD Bay. Is that true? The monitoring equipment is the responsibility of HUD Bay. That's correct. Right, so they are putting in the equipment that's going to measure whether or not they are in compliance. This is correct, right? So they have, if you look at some of the history of HUD Bay, we have some examples of their dealing with the public. Public that they had to interact with in the Constancia mine in Peru, in Cota Ocho in Guatemala, in El Estor in Guatemala, and in Flin Flon in their own country in Canada, where they did not act in good faith and they did not treat their communities well at all. Why do you trust them now? That's my question.
So the question, thank you so much. So the question, are they trustworthy given the record that has been cited here?
Thank you for the question, and it's a great question. We have a compliance and enforcement team and group at the agency, so every facility that we permit, whether it be HUD Bay, whether it be another company, anyone that's permitted by ADEQ, we have a team of inspectors like Rob that go out unannounced to confirm that they are operating within the terms of the permit. If they are not, we document an inspection report and we will then take enforcement action following the ADEQ compliance and enforcement policy. So yes, we don't trust any company at face value, right? It doesn't matter who they are. If they have a permit, they're going to get a knock on our door by one of my inspectors, unannounced, or in response to complaints that we receive from the community, right? So if they're doing something that you think is out of compliance, as Bob already mentioned, please go online, send us a thing, call us, send us an email. Give us the information on where you think the non-compliance is for this company or any other company in the area, and we will get an inspector out unannounced to see if they're in compliance with the permit or not.
And I would also say that I believe on the agenda, I have one here somewhere, there is a QR code that you can use for public comment. So that would be the way, yes, there you go. Thank you, Aaron. He's a much better man than I am. That would be the way that you could send out those reports if needed, all right? So please use that tool to do so. So I think Nancy was next, is that right, Aaron? Okay, come on up, Nancy.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm a healthcare provider, been a nurse practitioner in Southern Arizona for about the last 16 years. I see a lot of patients, I've seen patients in the past with a lot of lung disease, cardiovascular disease, small particles, 10 microns or less, are frequently implicated in worsening chronic diseases, cardiovascular, heart failure, emphysema, asthma. It's a real risk factor, especially for our elderly population and our kids. So with that background in mind, I'm concerned about the projecting that HUD Bay did about the possible concentrations of particulate matter, 10 microns or less, those emissions caused by winds blowing over the tailings piles. My understanding is that those modelings were allowed to exclude the extreme high-frequency wind events. Looking at that, why was that allowed? Someone speak to that.
Okay. So the question is exclusion of extreme high-frequency wind events, is that right?
Yeah.
And why would that be allowed?
Why wasn't that considered in the modeling? Because it seems to me sort of significant.
All right, Dr. Mao is going to help us out.
I'll try to take this question. So basically, when,
for the EP calculations, you need to took, based on the AP42, based on EP guidance, you need to use some fastest mile, which means, the gas weight. So for this case, actually, it's based on, the actual, the meteorological data, and they use a 45 mile per hour. So this number is 45 mile per hour to calculate this, the emissions from tailings based on the AP42 formula. So once you put this number, okay, based on 45 mile per hour emissions, you put this emission into model. So how to say, the model actually is a steady state model, which means that the prime time interval is 1 hour. So for this hour, actually, the model will use hourly average, data to calculate hourly average concentrations. Because next is based on, you can see the average time period for next is based on 1 hour, 3 hour, 8 hour, or 24 hour. So the model actually uses hourly average, inputs to calculate hourly average concentrations.
So you were looking at wind frequency like on an hourly average basis?
Yeah, one model actually, okay, for emission calculations, use short term, a few seconds, gusting winds, right? So 45 miles to calculate emissions.
Okay, so the cutoff was 45 miles an hour, that was the upper maximum that y'all considered?
Yeah.
So anything in that 1 hour that was over 45 miles an hour was not considered?
So 45 miles is the wind speed actually is used to calculate hourly average wind speed. So the short-term wind speed has been calculated to calculate hourly average wind speed.
Right. What about wind gusts that are over 45 miles an hour? We frequently have wind gusts that get higher than that, even if it's just momentarily. And
So
those do disperse.
So we calculate based on the data, calculate the fastest mile. The fastest mile based on the maximum 2 minutes average wind speed. So 40 miles is maximum 2 minutes average wind speed. It's not a few seconds because you cannot, based on the EPA formula, this is based on fastest mile, not based on a few second wind speed.
Yeah, I would argue that a few seconds of high wind speed can move small micron, the 2.5 micron, the 10 and smaller micron, they can move those. And that could be significant, especially for the one woman who we just heard about, who has a house that's like within a stone's throw. I understand what you're saying, I don't know if I agree with that.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? So we think about this all the time.
Okay.
So I think what FUMP is trying to establish, there are two different protocols. When we estimate emissions, that's where you put that maximum speed. We call it the fastest mile. That's the sustained wind speed that we see on a 2-minute basis. Not like a 1 second blip or a 5 second blip. We're talking about a 2 to 3 minute kind of an average. And that is a very well understood meteorological constant. That's how these calculations are run. So in a certain way, I would say that we are overestimating the emissions, right? Because we're not going to have the same heavy, fastest mile speeds all through the year, but we are taking them from an input standpoint. We are taking that number. But what he's also explaining is when it comes to actually running a model, the way the model is set up, and we don't have any ability to change how to input in the model, you have to put the hourly input, because the whole concept of a federal ambient standard for PM10, for example, is a 24-hour concept.
Right.
So what the model does is it kind of handcuffs you in a certain way. And we are tied to using the the hourly average wind speed. So that's the difference. Two different concepts. How you estimate emissions and how you run the model.
So the model that you're required to use, you're saying is hampering you in this regard.
That's how it's set up. You are supposed to input the hourly measure.
So, and from what I saw, you had some figures up there showing that the 150 micron was like the national emissions cutoff, right? And I saw a number up there like 147, right? So if you're that close, and you've got a model that's sort of monkeying up the works,
Yeah.
and you have a responsibility to protect public health, can we not err on the side and say, you know, we saw this coming and act now, instead of proactively 10, 15, 20 years down the road when we get a cluster of cancer and worsening cases in the community, say, well, yeah, we sort of saw that, but we didn't act. I don't want to be looking in the mirror. I don't want to be the one looking in the mirror saying I could prevent it. So,
Thank you, Nancy, appreciate that. Was there some follow-up on that, Karla? You're gonna connect with that? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So I want to respond to you just a little bit more. You know, you brought up the number of 147, and you're absolutely correct. You know, we pulled up a table and just talked about the number being 147 instead of being 150. I don't want to appear like I'm dancing around your question, but I want to give you some context around the model.
yeah.
Models are inherently very conservative. That's how these models are designed. The EPA Air model
Yeah.
is typically meant to overestimate a little, right? So it gives you that wiggle room to work with.
Right.
The other thing is the fundamentally, and I think Jeff showed a slide where how a model works and how the inputs are done, right? You have all these wind speeds, emissions, all these inputs, and also the local net conditions, you know, wind speed, wind direction. And then you are taking the model concentration and then you're overlaying it on top of a regional background. And that's how we come with this N number, which was 147. One of the things that we do to be extremely conservative is that we assume that the maximum model concentration from the facility and the maximum backgrounds happen at the exact same time. That is inherently a very aggressive and conservative assumption, because in reality, it never works like that. Those days are not the same day. So what we are doing is, by virtue of overlaying them on top of each other, we are building a tremendous level of conservativeness to how the model is being run. Because we are overestimating, you are foreseeing the air model run by itself is a little bit of an over-prediction. Plus on top of it, we are assuming both of these are happening on the exact same day, at the exact same time.
Come to my house and say that. Because I live on the side of the mountain and it's different than 2 houses down.
Okay, all right.
Just saying.
All right, thank you, Nancy, appreciate that. I think David is going next. And did we get to, where do we need to go on this, guys? I was supposed to forward some. Thank you, David, for coming up. Can you tell me the correct slide? Keep going. This right here? Perfect, thank you. Okay, David, yes, go ahead.
My name is David DeGroot. I'm a retired educator from Murrieta. My question is along the same lines as previous. My background, I have an anecdotal comment and then empirical, and then that'll lead to my question. I'll keep it within 3 minutes. My experience hiking in the northern Santa Rita is that the wind is extremely variable. It's coming over the 6,000 foot ridges down to the 4,000 foot level, even direction. Years ago, I used to think that there may be a westerly wind direction in the Tucson Basin, but I don't believe that anymore. This is my anecdotal experience. I went to the TWC weather website and did a little research about wind direction, and they plot out hourly wind direction, and that showed me that while I have results, but in a nutshell, it changes. Different parts of the day, the wind is coming from the north, from the south, northeast, this is around the Murrieta, Tucson, to the airport area. A lot of changes. And I'll get to that's my empirical statement. that can be plotted out.
Part 2, right? Part 2?
Yes.
Okay.
That can be plotted out, and that can be proven that the wind is from all different directions. And I'd also also like to bring up the question of altitude. I haven't heard, I thought I heard ground level. Am I correct on that? The measurements should all be at ground level?
It'll be in there. But it doesn't count, the model doesn't count.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, let's just have you give that answer, Jeff.
So, like you said, the model does account for changes in elevation inherently. These are part of the terrain that's input into the air mod. So if a haul road is going from the 6,000 foot ridgeline going down to the 4,000 foot summit, or base of the mountain where the processing facility is, that change in elevation will all be accounted for in the model and in the description. And yes, the concern of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or ambient air, is going to be the air that you breathe. So it is going to be ground level pollution as opposed to something like the formation of stratospheric ozone. For ADEQ, just an example of pollution, we're concerned about ozone that we're breathing as people, not so much the ozone in the high up areas. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit.
Just to clarify, the haul road will actually be up pretty close to the 6,000 foot level when it goes around the broad top view. So we've got high and low. I would encourage ADEQ, I appreciate the comment about using a conservative model, but I would go beyond conservative. My gosh, we've had tornadoes in Tucson this summer. We've had unusual air stuff going on. My neighborhood, I've got roof replacement trucks all over the neighborhood because the shingles blew off. For the first time, people who lived in Tucson for 50, 80 years say they've never seen anything like it. So I'm sorry, but my comment, and then I'll say that, my comment is that I just don't trust the models right now. It seems like things are changing all around us.
Okay, thank you, David. Appreciate that
So next up, we have Bill Ruiz, then Chuck Stack to talk about mistaken permit, and then Nina Luxembourg to talk about the air permit.
Okay, Bill, come on up, sir.
So good evening. I want to thank you guys are the experts. I'm not. I had a question coming into the meeting tonight, which you all answered my question. How will the permit allow for the protection of the environment? And I wrote the answer to myself that I wanted to share, and that was the mitigation and suppression techniques were well observed and noted. The compliance and monitoring reporting protocols were well presented. The department has shown the science and methods followed is well written into the plan. And I am very encouraged that our working men and women that would go work there will have the confidence to work safely there. And, you know, you're talking about chemicals and ores and things like that that will be released. And our members with the carpenters are trained with N95 masks for silica that gets blown up all the time with wind. It's uncontrollable. You never know what's going to happen. So we are trained by safety and health experts on how to stay safe on a job. We rely on engineers. We rely every day that nothing's going to collapse and fall on us. I have the faith and confidence that we can rely on engineers doing their job with their training so we will all be safe. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. It was Bill, right? Thank you. All right, Chuck? Come on forward, Chuck. Thank you for coming up.
Well, I want to thank all of you guys. I actually do work for the government as a subject matter expert. Jeff, you did a great job, by the way, with the presentation. You just flowed perfectly. And my name's Charles Stack. I'm an environmental consultant. I work with all sorts of industries, including the mining industry. My degrees from the University of Illinois include a degree in public health, and my exact title, board certified environmental scientist. So I work with the American Society of Civil Engineers. I just recently was co-authored a publication, draft standards that we put for water protection. So I'm very familiar with the very hard position these gentlemen have. That being said, I believe this line is a mistake, and the one reason I believe it's a mistake more than anything is its location. It's going to be up in an elevation over a valley of people, and keep in mind my public health background, the median age in Green Valley is about 70 years of age. We have hospitals, we have schools. I used to teach at Walden Grove High School in South Murrieta. And we have a vulnerable population. Now, everything, you add that to it, they plan on building a sulfuric acid production plant. I've worked with those things, okay? Fan Steel Metals in Tulsa, Oklahoma have a plant that exploded and killed a bunch of people. These are very dangerous facilities, and they want to build one hanging 1,000 feet in the air over Quail Creek and Corona de Tucson and, you know, all our other communities here, South Murrieta, and Green Valley. And one of the things I mentioned, I went going through the permit, the production of sulfuric acid is very dangerous. You take yellow sulfur, see what they're going to do is produce yellow elemental sulfur, like chemistry set sulfur, we've all seen that stuff. They're going to produce it as a byproduct of their chemical processing. They will then use that, because they have a sulfide ore, they will then use that recovered sulfur to produce the sulfuric acid on site. Other mines, most of the mines in Arizona have to purchase sulfuric acid and bring it in by tanker. And they want to do all of the stuff on site, which is, you know, I would say, hey, really cool, go ahead and do that, except you are 1,000 feet above mean sea level over Quail Creek, where I used to have a house. When I found out about this thing, we sold it and moved out. And the other thing is that these plants are very risky because of their emissions. And somebody mentioned altitude. One feature of this valley is we get atmospheric inversions, especially in the winter. So you're going to get a cap of warm air, and then it keeps things. I remember walking around the winter, you choke on the smell of fireplace fumes. People are burning wood in places like so any type of an emission or an industrial accident, you run the risk of that stuff flowing down the side of the mountain and sitting in a population of very vulnerable people. I will say this to ADEQ, if you were to deny that permit for that sulfuric acid plant, they would go away. They would not be able to afford it. This sulfuric acid plant is going to produce more sulfuric acid than they need to mine that copper. It's going to be a profit center. And they're going to sell it, and they say in the PEA that it will de-risk the operation. In other words, if the price of copper is soft, or they would lose money on the copper itself, they could make money selling sulfuric acid to Freeport, McMoran, and the other mines in Arizona and elsewhere.
You're about 3 minutes. Did you have a question?
No, my question is just, I don't know that you consider the environmental aspects adequately. Here is paper on sulfur trioxide. You talk about sulfur dioxide in your permitting, and I understand why. Sulfur trioxide is an intermediate chemical that they use to make sulfuric acid. There's a very strong risk of public health implications from that. So, did you gentlemen consider all the implications, public health implications of sulfuric acid production? That's my question.
Yes, thank you so much.
Sure, please do.
What I'd say in response is, first I can comment about Rosemond's economic plans, with respect to why they want to put the acid plant, partially to produce acid for their own operations or even to sell it commercially to somebody else. What I will actually go back to, Chuck, is really what we talked about with respect to the rigor of the modeling. And I don't know how compelling it's going to be for you, but the modeling, whether we think of it as a perfect science or not, is the best tool out there. In terms of mathematically simulating what's going to go out, it takes topography into account, it takes altitude into account, it takes wind speeds and wind directions, and the conclusion that they're coming to, based on the way the facility is going to be set up, the way the controls are going to be operating, we believe the impacts coming off the plant at the fence line and beyond is going to be safe. That's our position right now based on the model. The one thing I'll also take a step further, can talk about this even a bit more if needed, is they're going to have some continuous emissions monitoring systems attached to the acid plant. So that's not very typical with respect to other parts of the plant. Other parts of the plant, you're relying on parametric monitoring. You do something once every week or every 2 weeks to look at a certain parameter. But here, you're actually going to be measuring emissions on a continuous basis. So I think that's what I offered to you back in the time.
I'm familiar with that, when I work with refineries, I work with power plants, and part of my expertise is environmental risk management. You have to say to yourself, can this project be done safely? And like I said, I imagine if you built an oil refinery in the same location, they want to put this thing, or a rendering plant. People, so they just kind of snuck this thing in the PEA. They say, yeah, we're going to build a sulfuric acid plant. Keep that in mind. And they also say, and they go in the PEA, they go through a great deal of information about their commercial plants. They're going to make a lot of sulfuric acid. So you're going to have tanker trucks of sulfuric acid going up and down Rita Ranch Road, or whatever it's called. Nogales Highway, it'll be going on to 10. And remember, it was what? I think it was February 14th, a year or so ago, we had a big, there's a nitric acid tanker tipped over and spilled. These accidents do happen. So again, environmental risk management, public health protection, is this what we want in our community? And I work with Freeport-McMoran, we've got BHP, I've done work with some of their mines. I'm actually pro-mining and pro-metal, but only if it's done correctly. This doesn't seem like it's done correctly to me.
Thank you, Jim. All right, Nina, I think, come on up. Thank you, Nina. Or is it Nina? I might be missing. If you would have it's like, oh, it's a little high.
I have a question about the air pollution control system. The dust collectors that we were told about, they can achieve high levels of coarse particulate matter control, but they don't necessarily achieve the same levels of particles that are less than 10 micrometers. And I'm concerned the emissions of these really small particles have been underestimated by HUD. Those are the ones that they get into our air stacks. And I don't find it reassuring to have your hotline number in case you have symptoms. Because as you said, they're about the size of a hair particle, and we're not going to have symptoms. You don't cough those things up. They stay in the air stacks, the alveoli. And our blood circulation is exchanged for oxygen, carbon dioxide in the lungs. So these really tiny particles can then get into our bloodstream. Our children are at risk. We're at risk. I'm a physician, I'm a radiologist, and I've seen thousands of x-rays of chronic lung disease and thousands of patients who have cancer. I trained at Memorial Sloan Kettering. You are subjecting this public to chronic disease and a cancer risk that you don't even know it's going to be, 20, 30, 40 years from now when our children are grown. And they die prematurely because you had to build a mine right in our community. Now, HUD asserts that the dust collectors that they're going to use will catch small particles with 99% efficiency. Let's be realistic. Over the lifetime of the proposed mine, there would have to be no malfunctions, no upsets, and no human error. That's not possible. So why is ADEQ accepting HUD-based assertion that they can monitor, that they can filter out these small particles? And what are you going to do to make sure that there's adequate air pollution control? You said in your talk that HUD is responsible with an ambient monitoring station. Where is an independent inspector? And why are we trusting HUD to monitor when they have said things that aren't true, and we're very concerned about small particles which they're underestimating, in my opinion.
So the question was about monitoring. whether they're doing their own monitoring or if it's external, from what I heard. Thank you so much for the question. Jeff, did you want to take that?
Yeah, so I think those are some great questions. First thing I want to touch on is it's mentioned that dust collection equipment isn't capable of controlling fine particulate matter. ADEQ has an extensive experience performance testing similar dust control systems to what's being proposed for the Copper World project. And these performance tests are split to bifurcate between PM10 and PM2.5 as well. So we have extreme confidence that these control systems will actually operate as the vendors guarantee. We've gone through this exact process with similar facilities, and they've all been able to comply with those limits. So I do understand the concern about it. It is a lot of high degree of control efficiency for those processes, but it's supplied by vendor guarantees that ADEQ has had an extensive experience by actually seeing these performance tests conducted and comply with the permit emission limits. And another thing is the Copper World project permit does include individual emission limitations for PM10 and PM2.5, which they're required to performance test for. So if they are violating those staff test limits, then there will be some kind of enforcement to follow. And if they're indefinitely not able to comply with those limits, then that will require extensive permitting work to either not to maintain their permit or maintain compliance. So that's kind of where we would go with that right now, I think.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Aaron, who do we have up next?
First, we have Stephen T. Oswiak. Next is Jean Vickers for air permit, keeping dust down. And then after that is Peggy Olerhead with air quality monitoring questions. So,
okay, Stephen, go ahead. Thank you.
So first, if you'll take it, I'd like to yield my time slot to Professor Kirsten Engel so that we can hear from her sooner than later. Is she still here?
Kirsten, are you here? I don't see anybody standing up. Okay.
She's there.
Oh, she is, okay. All right, and then we'll go to Jean and Peggy. Thank you, Kirsten, for coming up.
Hello, thank you for having me. And it's really great to see so many people have turned out here for this hearing. And thank you very much for the detail. I have been learning a tremendous amount as I listen to this. It couldn't be more important. This is an enormous facility, an open pit mine. I was also present at the water hearing, and also really, really great comments and concerns that were raised about that. To the extent I was thinking of a question that I hadn't heard addressed, and that was just understanding in the modeling or when you are taking tests, whether you're looking just at the particles that are coming from the mine, or are you also taking into account the background of dust and small particles that are in the ambient air? And of course, we're here in hot, dusty Arizona, and if you have a big windstorm, you're certainly going to have a lot of background dust as well. And not just from natural processes, but any other construction facilities or other roads, et cetera. Is that all taken into account? And to the extent that that changes into the future, is that also taken into account? So, thank you.
So, gentlemen, particles from the mine exclusively, or are we considering other ambient considerations, I guess you would say.
Thank you for the question. So, yes, we're taking into account the background and also what's happening in the mind. So that's part of the model. So we're taking all this, as Paul explained before, we're aligning the background and the worst case from the model for a conservative approach, right? So we are looking at the worst case in the model from background and what's happening at that facility and what's happening in the area. So anything that's happening from other industries or operations in the area is included in the background model, which is added to what's happening from the mind. Okay, so I'm sure.
Any further thoughts, Kristen?
The other question I had, I found it very interesting to hear the testimony about the sulfuric acid aspect of the mine. Is that part of the air quality permit, or?
Yeah, so that is a portion of the air quality permit. They have stringent emission limitations for sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and particulate matter, condensable particulate matter that may result from operation of the facility, and they'll be required to continuously monitor the emissions of the gases as well as do tech testing for the condensable particulate matter that results from it. So, yeah, ADEQ has experience with mining facilities that have sulfuric acid plants, and while they are high pressure, high temperature operations, and they do have some inherent danger as those types of processes would. We've seen a lot of success in a sulfuric acid plant being operated at the Sept mine, and haven't had significant issues with that. So I think, given that this will be a modern sulfuric acid plant, the assumption is that it should be, operated at a high level.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, Jean, I think, was next. Come on up, Jean.
Hi, my name is Jean Vickers. I'm a lifelong asthmatic from infancy. And when we moved here 16 years ago, our backyard, I walk out the slider, I look left, and I'm looking right at where the open pit will be. And within a year of moving here 16 years ago, my asthma kicked in. The medications I was taking were not working. I went to the Mayo Clinic and was diagnosed again with cough-reactive asthma, and found out I had 11 nodules on my lungs, basically scar tissue from prior asthma attacks. I am very concerned about fugitive emissions, which you seem to have absolutely no control over in the permitting process. Those of us who live here experience what is called the Vale Gale. Do you recognize that term? We also, when we first moved here, saw a 45-pound Adirondack cedar underwood chair get moved by the wind about 25 yards across our lawn, tumbling over by a gust of wind that came off of the Santa Rita Mountains. So wind is coming off those mountains, wind will come off those tailing ponds, and if that dust, those fugitive emissions are not kept under control, and it doesn't seem you have any way to do that in the permitting process, demand that those are kept under control, inspect that they're come under control. I would like to have one of your testing stations in my backyard, because I want to know when there's toxic wind coming off of that mine, so that I don't die of an asthma attack.
Question about controlling fugitive emissions.
First of all, I strongly empathize with your asthmatic condition. I certainly want to acknowledge that the one thing to keep in mind when we talk about modeling and we talk about the concept of NACS, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the way the federal government designs them, they are meant for protection for the elderly and people with compromised respiratory situations. So people like you. So the idea really is the numbers are set at a level that is protective of people with health conditions like you. So I want to give you that assurance. Secondly, I think you mentioned that the permit is nothing at all about fugitives, and I think I disagree with you on that, and I'll tell you why. So we acknowledge very openly that based on state law and federal law, we are unable to count the emissions from these roads and tailings as part of the decision determination on what kind of permit they need. You remember the class 2 versus class 1 concept? However, even though we can't count them, they are very much a part of our air dispersion model. So when we model facility-wide, all these sources which have the controls, they are modeled. Plus on top of it, these roadways and these tailings, they're all part of the model. So from that perspective, I disagree with you that we are doing nothing about it. We are certainly addressing them as part of the model, and sum total, all the impact from the project collectively, we believe are compliant with the federal standards. And aside from the modeling portion of it, the permit has a lot of requirements for them to do inspections, to apply water, apply chemical dust suppression, inspect for physical integrity. So there are a lot of those concepts that we believe are going to go a long way to ensure that there is not like this, incredible wind event where the dust is kicked up and moving miles and miles. That is what the permit is aspiring to do. We are trying to ensure that we are delivering the emissions to the ground, keep it where they need to be, that way they are not being pushed out of the property all the way up to your community.
All right, thank you, Balaji. I think next we're going to Peggy. Thanks for coming forward, Peggy.
Hello, my name is Peggy Alderhead. I'm a retired school psychologist, and part of my interest in attending this meeting stems from the fact that in the early part of my career, in the early 1990s, I worked for the Kennedy Krieger Institute, which was a children's brain development hospital affiliated with Johns Hopkins. It was their children's hospital units, specifically designed for children with disorders of the brain. And I did evaluations, and a large part of the evaluations I did were for children who had suffered lead poisoning. And after having experienced that and seeing the devastating effects of this, lead is considered a neurotoxin for children, and they're particularly at risk to ages of 7 and under. Although at the time, like some of the things people have mentioned before, you don't always see the effects immediately until you get to really a critical mass. And I mean, it was traumatic enough for me that I felt like I had a moral imperative to come here and speak and tell you that according to the Journal of the American Medical Association in Pediatrics, and this is the direct quote, there is no safe level of exposure to lead that has been identified for children, period. And so I know that the federal standards that you mentioned were lead 0.15 micrograms for all cubic meters, per cubic meters. I mean, that just isn't good enough. I mean, and I know that the people here who live in this area have major concerns. People who live in housing developments nearby, because children play in the outside. That's part of what makes them so vulnerable. They play in the dirt, and these things aggregate over time. They land in the dirt. I mean, the children I worked with mostly got it from lead paint poisoning, from housing stock before the 1950s. And now you're not allowed to use lead paint in housing anymore. I mean, people took action on it. And I think now we're just beginning to understand the effects of environmental lead poisoning. And I think it would be helpful, I don't know this, is it possible to actually, I'm a pragmatist, I work with real people and I see the real effects. So I wonder if there's ways, like you mentioned, being happy to have a monitoring station right near your house because of the effects of asthma. Well, we know that there's a school within 1.5 miles of the proposed mine and that there's some housing units. Can't we do some testing actually there or does it all have to be within a certain perimeter of the mine? especially people volunteer. I also would like to see some requirements for education for pediatricians and other people in this area to be looking for the effects of lead poisoning before it's too late. And I know a lot of the gentlemen here work in the mines and are aware of the mine safety, but I also wanted to make you aware, not to scare you, but just for your knowledge, if you have children at home, one of the things that's really important now is the concept of take-home lead. People who work in different occupations, even people who work in medical facilities where the use of lead is involved in some treatments. So you want to make sure, like, if you come home, you take off your clothes before you bring them in. You don't want to expose your young children to this, because under the effects it has on you as an adult is very different than the effects it has on a developing brain, which it's a neurotoxin. And I had the sad impact of seeing children who had been exposed as when they were younger, and it has dramatic effects on learning, cognitive ability, some of which are not reversible with treatment. So it's something I just feel is a moral imperative. I know you're an expert on a lot of the technical aspects of your job, but I don't know if you're aware of what a significant impact this can have for our youth.
So Peggy, the question I'm hearing is the effects of lead and whether the aggregate of that could be dangerous for communities, and especially.
That's not my question, I know this.
Okay, what is the question? I'm sorry, that's how I understood it.
Can you actually set up a monitor near the schools?
Okay.
The school that's within 1.5 miles, can you set it up near some of the neighborhoods? So there can be at least some alerts when people have been exposed.
Let's get an answer to that, all right? Gentlemen?
Thank you for the question. Yes, lead, there is no safe level for lead for children. Yes, that is scientifically, yeah. As for the question for lead, the mine's not operating yet, but they have an on-site met data and air quality, so I'm gonna wait and see what that data shows. And I'm not opposed to potentially putting monitoring depending on what happens with the mine in operation. So since I've been director of the air quality division, we have done community monitoring across the state for PM and other contaminants, right? So as there are concerns once the mine is operating, that is something we'll definitely consider. But at this time, I think it's a little premature to make that commitment.
Well, given the severity of it, I think, like I said, I just considered it a moral imperative for me to make sure that people are aware of the significant impact that this neurotoxin has on children, and how, what you're able to do about it, I don't know. But if I lived near there, or my children went to school near there, I would want to know, not just about what's in the air, but what's in the soil, has landed and is now aggregated in the soil.
Okay.
That they play in every day on the playgrounds.
Thank you. All right, Aaron, who do we have coming up next?
So next up is Chris Workoven to discuss the permit application, then Eric Mesa to discuss blasting, and then Doreen Vitrio to discuss water.
Thank you for being here. My name is Chris Workoven, and I live in Noida. I'm very interested in what's happening around us, of course. And by listening to what people emphasized on tonight, I'm convinced that your health and your future also depends on two things. And one is the modeling that is being promoted, and secondly, the standards that we are supposed to adhere to. Both have their flaws. The modeling is, as we heard, as reliable and as predictive as it could be, but it may not cover all the aspects of what's going on in activities like this. And the outcomes of the modeling is as good as what you put in as input parameters. So, by looking at the air permit application, I couldn't find many references to what was actually put in as input parameters. In particular, of course, the metal parts of it. It was surprising to find a very high emitted volume of manganese compounds. So my first question is, where does the manganese come from? That could have been made clear in what we call the, what's supposed to be the Appendix F in the application, where we should have seen the contributions of road traffic and other sources of particles on the total emission of this mine. Appendix F, as far as I could see in the documentation, is an empty page. So we couldn't verify what was going on. So maybe we can get,
I'd be happy to.
okay.
So, the manganese emissions for the facility are based on the total particulate matter emissions from the facility. You'll find that in the emissions summary tab of the Appendix F, which is available on the website. It's in the permits and interest webpage for the final application. You'll find the emissions calculation spreadsheets for each one. So the manganese emissions were then measured based on ore sampling. So how much manganese is in the ore body for the Copper World project. So we feel these estimations are actually relatively conservative because you won't expect to see the same degree of manganese and other metals in the ore body in areas such as haul roads, where you might have much lower levels of those metals in the soil and in the rock that's used to develop those roads. That's kind of how those were developed, and I'd be happy to direct you to the emissions calculations on the website after this presentation, just so you can take a direct look at that.
Yeah, that would be.
So first, real quick, I also want to commit that we will email you Appendix F, right? So if you give us your email address, we will get that to you, so you don't have to go to the website and try to find it. So if you can't find it initially, we'll get it to you.
That would be great, but probably a lot of other people that want to do the same thing, verify what has been done for the permit as input parameters to get to the answer, the conclusions basically. Last question is on the standards. The standards are also based on literature and investigations by the medical community, basically. There's a recent publication of the neighbors in Phoenix, the Barrows Institute of Neurological Science, that published a new study about the correlation between Parkinson and PM 2.5. And when you read that article, it shows a correlation way below the current standard. Are you willing to invite these doctors and explain what the dangers are below the current standard?
Who would like to take that? Daniel?
So we're not medical doctors, right? So appreciate that, and the science and that information is very valuable and important. However, our regulatory box, the standards are set by the EPA, they're federal, state, and local regulations. So we are only to enforce the standards and implement the standards that are codified in law. So in the PM 2.5 standard, the annual standard is just been lowered by EPA. So it went from 12 down to 9 micrograms per cubic meter, and this permit meets those requirements of the 9 micrograms per cubic meter. So I'm limited based on what the authority gives us, right? It'd be unlawful for me to have a lower standard. I just don't have any mechanism to implement that.
Thank you, Dan.
I understand the problem. I understand the
Yeah,
process.
stand real close.
Yes, I understand the process. But these are public data, verified by peer doctors across the world, actually. So this is serious information that needs to be taken into account. At what level that can be started, I'm not sure about that. But this could be one.
All right, thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. I understand that Aaron left, but he turned his time over to Rob. Is Rob, come on up. Oh, yes, I know Rob. I forget the names, I'm so sorry.
Eric had to leave for a home, and so he asked me to ask his question. I'm Rob Peters, Executive Director of Save the City San Luis. The question has to do with fugitive emissions from blasting. And the idea here is that it's understanding that the timing of blasting can play a big role in the actual emissions of like nitrogen dioxide, for example. And the example that was given to us was, let's say the charges are set on a particular day, but they're not they're not set off that day, so they're there overnight, and they may absorb ambient moisture, which increases the amount of nitrogen dioxide release. And so, so this is going to be a fugitive emission. And so I guess the questions are several. One, A, is that true? B, if it is true, do you guys have, as part of your prescription, have to do with the timing to minimize those kinds of secondary effects from not blasting in a timely way? And maybe that's it. Thank you.
So that is a great question. So there are requirements in the permit that limit the times for conducting blasting at each pit, and they are determined based on times that would maximize dispersion and minimize impact on ambient body quality. So the point is to not have these plumes hanging and then eventually drop on the valley and, impact the community. So yeah, there are several limits on the permit that restrict blasting, whether it's the surface area that they're blasting over, the frequency that they blast per pit, or the amount of ammonium nitrate fuel oil mixture that can be used for the charge. And they are required to do blasting within, good operating practices. So one of those I would say would be leaving charges in a blast cap for an extended period of time where it's going to, like you said, absorb that ambient moisture and cause impacts, or maybe not have emissions consistent with what's estimated. So I think for the Copper World project, they're going to prefer to do their blasting immediately unless there's some kind of weather event that restricts that. But the permit does require them to do blasting at times that maximize dispersion and minimize impacts on the community. That's how it's spelled, yes.
Thank you. I'm forgetting the next name. Doreen, that's a good one. Doreen. Come on up, Doreen. She has a little bit of a walk. Thank you for coming. You're getting your steps in, right? There you go. You can come right up here, Doreen. Thank you.
So I want to talk to you guys first, okay, so you understand where I come from. I'm a Bisbee, Arizona native. I was born, my grandfather was a miner. My dad was a miner. My uncle was a miner in Murrieta. So my uncle was a miner in Murrieta. So I come from a long line of miners. My dad always told me this: you've got to look where the money is. Where's the money? I think everyone's missing this point here. You guys have a lot of people here that are going to make some money, a lot of money. They want to make the money. It's for their families. Then you have a lot of people over here that say, absolutely not. I want to protect my family. I want to protect my investment. You're talking about 19% drop in housing values. That's money. Now we're talking about kids. You look at that little act statement over there, it's so simple. You guys are all talking a bunch of mathematical, your numbers, your stuff. And I was married to a hydrologist. He goes around, he went ahead and was at Area 51, he cleaned up their mess. Now he's in Oak Ridge, he's cleaning up their mess too. Because once this stuff gets into the water, which you all are just like, oh yeah, it's just, it's just in the water. No, your kids will be drinking this water. Your kids are gonna be playing in the dirt. So you guys make lots of money, but are you gonna move your kids in this area? Are you gonna let them go to school right next to this mine? You're gonna make money? No, you're gonna move all the way far away because you're not gonna want your kids right next door to what y'all are doing. This is wrong in every sense of the way. And you know what? It's simple. It doesn't need to be all these models because you can, I'm also educated. I'm a master's degree in education, and I was married to a very smart man, and I'm remarried to an amazing smart man. So, and he works for the Post, Fort Huachuca. So I come from this area. I bought my dream home in this area. And I'm telling you, I want to sell now because I know what's going to happen up there. And you know what, it is so sad because let me just tell you, these guys use all their models and stuff and they can manipulate every single number. And they do it, they sit for hours and hours and hours because I was married to a man that did all that and he had his master's degree. Yeah, my question is this. What are you guys going to do that disagree with what is going on? Where are you guys going to stand up to what's going to happen? Because it's going to impact each one of you. These people that are making the money, they're going to be out. These people right here that are going to give the permit, they're making money because if they don't give permits to mines, they're out of business. So just think about that.
Thanks, Joe. All right, who's next? Is there a Jessamy? We can't quite read the writing. Jessamy?
You won't believe this, but she put this in my hand and asked me if
Okay, so we have Rob once again. We'll trust you on that, Rob.
I'll do my best. The question has to do with processing ores other than copper, particularly I think gold and silver. You guys talked about that before. And her question had to do specifically with the chemicals that are used to do that processing and what you specifically have in place to prevent the dissemination of toxics in the air coming off of those. I think you sort of got at that with the molybdenum, yeah.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, so the apprentice metal refinery portion of the plant is subject to requirements of the permit. It does have control equipment or any processing operations associated with it, dust collection equipment, so it'll capture any of the condensable particulate matter and metals that are generated by any of the processes associated with the refining and capture of those precious metals. So, yeah, you're right. The gold, the silver, the molybdenum, those all occur with copper in that ore. And the process that they're doing is to separate each one of those components out and, recover the valuable amounts of it. Otherwise, they'd be, sending some of those metals to a tailings storage facility, for instance, where it's not going to be recovered and it might be stored indefinitely. So, yeah, that's a great point. And there's requirements in the permit to make sure that they are operating those facilities to minimize emissions.
Thank you, Jeff. All right. We have 3 more. We're kind of getting to the end here, just to let people know. It looks like we have Mark Davis and Brian Mole. So Mark and then Brian.
My name is Mark Davis. I had a couple of questions for you folks. One of them is, I know you folks monitor a lot of facilities here in Arizona. Can you tell us a little bit more about how a process like this works as far as enforcement, monitoring, things like that? For other facilities in your jurisdiction. And then also, I wanted to ask a little bit more, just thought it might be helpful to know more about the difference between a Class 2 and a Class 1 air quality, and why a Class 2 is also below.
Okay, And so a little bit about enforcement and then the difference between a class 1 and class 2 permit.
No worries.
So your first question was about what goes on in the permitting process.
Well, what goes on in permitting and enforcement?
Perfect, okay. So we touched on it a little bit, but let me expand on it a bit more. When we go through the permit evaluation, application evaluation process, we talked about estimating emissions to figure out the kind of permit they need, and also to figure out if the impacts are acceptable, right? So one of the key things that we do in the permit is to take those assumptions and put them in the permit. And the thing that our inspectors, people like Rob, look out for is when they go out there, they're looking for exactly those records. For example, I talked about throughput. They need to process less than 200,000 tons per day. Rob is going to be verifying, over time. You may look at 6 months of records and show that they are taking below the number, right? And there are multiple other limits to the permit, emission limits, operating concepts, and so on. Should we find a facility to be non-compliant, that's where our enforcement process kicks in. So we have the enforcement handbook that gives us some very clear principles on how we handle certain violations. Right? So the whole idea for us is when we do discover a violation, we are able to work with the permitting board in this instance to return them back to compliance period. Because if there's truly environmental harm being propagated, we don't want to take 6 months to go fix it, right? We want to be very speedy about it. So you will typically see us write these notices back to the company and put down notices and say, okay, we inspected your facility in such state, and we discovered, let's say 3 or 4 different violations. And then, based on our knowledge, obviously permitting a lot of mines. We permitted about 10 different mines for a long time. We kind of know, okay, this is going to take you this long to get back into compliance. Some of it may require you to put a brand new control device, so that may take a bit longer. But you put them on a very prescriptive pathway to return them back to compliance.
So there are real teeth to this process. It's not just, somebody.
That's the whole intention, right? Because, Daniel talked about it too. It's one of those trust but verifying models. Because, we accept information, using engineering principles. But at the end of the day, we have to verify that copper board is able to live up to the expectations that they convey in their application, right? So, and to the extent that some of these violations are egregious, and they are extremely environmentally significant, we can do some very significant things. Some of it will involve us applying penalties on the company and try to let them return back to compliance. So clearly the permitting process is one part of the puzzle, but what we do after it from a compliance standpoint, that is a big part of it too. Does that answer your question?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Okay. Was there another question?
Yeah, my other question was on the Class 1 versus Class 2 permit.
Yeah.
Why a Class 2 permit is believed to be adequate for copper.
Yeah, the game comes back to an emission concept, right? So we talked about this whole idea of what is called potential to emit. And, there are certain source categories, within both federal regulations and state regulations, where if you belong to it, examples are like a Portland cement operation or a copper smelting operation, you're legally required to count 2 different kinds of emissions. One's called fugitive, which is like the open, the roadways, the open areas, the storage pipes, and so on. And then there are these other emissions which are factored through like a control device and a stack, right? The copper mine is a source category where we are legally prohibited from including the fugitive emissions in our evaluation. So what that means is the potential to emit that we look at for a project at Copper World is limited to non-fugitive emissions. And since those emissions, and we put a table up there before to show that, if those emissions are below what is called the major source threshold, and Jeff had a slide on that, if they are below, and they are below the 100 tons per year for what we call the criteria pollutants, and then there is a threshold of 10 tons for any one single hazardous air pollutant, or 25 tons in combination. If you're below all those thresholds, you do qualify to get a Class 2 permit, and that's what they've applied for.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, I think the next person is Brian. Yeah. Brian, come on over here. Yeah, this one.
Could you pull up the slide for PM10, please? The map of the, yeah. Yeah, thank you. So my name is Brian Mall. I'm a resident here in the community, and your name is Jeff, right? That was a really good brief. Really, your knowledge of the chemistry is really why I'm up here asking this question. So, like many other people brought up, this isn't just a copper mine. So there's going to be actually mining or using, getting some of the products from the silver, the gold, and then the sulfur, in addition to the sulfuric acid operations going on. And that's where I had more questions than some of the other people brought them up. But two chemicals in particular. The first one was sulfur dioxide, which the gentleman over here brought up a lot of those really extreme health concerns that I'm not going to get into. But another one that sounds like it's a byproduct of some of these processes, which I just wanted to see if you could verify, was hydrogen sulfide. So that one's, it's got a really bad smell. It's known in low concentrations, 0.005 parts per million makes it a significant odor nuisance. This is the rotten egg smell, as well as the rotten egg smell that comes from the sulfur dioxide. But for the guys that are working on the plant, at higher concentrations, this chemical is extremely hazardous. Prolonged exposure to levels as low as 20 to 50 parts per million cause eye irritation, respiratory issues, and other symptoms. And anything over 100 parts per million can lead to more severe effects, including loss of smell, respiratory distress, and even death. Very serious. That's not what I'm going to ask you about. What I want to ask you about is actually this rotten egg smell. So these are known to be parts of this process. So even if everything on that map, which thought I was going to have to argue that the predominant winds shift from the mine to our community, but that's obviously captured in this model. Most of the year, most of the time, that's where the wind's going to come from. Is it going to smell like rotten egg smells that are happening there? Like, how is that going to affect our community?
So, hydrogen sulfide, like you mentioned, can be a byproduct of sulfur combustion, but it's not the primary product of it. Sulfur dioxide is the primary product. And in the sulfuric acid plant, that sulfur dioxide is converted to sulfur trioxide before it's scrubbed out and captured by water as sulfuric acid. At the stack of the sulfuric acid plant, there will be what's called a scrubber. So what happens is the air exhausted from the stack of that sulfuric acid plant has a scrubber solution, sometimes water, sometimes caustic solution, something more higher control efficiency. And what that will do is capture any of the gases that are coming out of there and scrub them out. And hydrogen sulfide will be something that's, if it is present in the exhaust gas, it would become scrubbed out. So the expectation would be that there would be any rotten egg odor, especially at that distance from the facility.
Right, thank you, Brian. Okay, looks like our next four, we have Randy, Becky, Michelle, and Maina. So Randy, Becky, Michelle, and Maina. Randy? Good evening.
Okay, so I have a question. So I run models and simulations every day. I've been an engineer for 20 years. Usually they're run in the perfect world, state. And it's also run from historical data of stuff that we already have. But our environment changes constantly. So how are you accounting for that change when you don't have any data to map that, to map the model up? As far as the wind speeds, how it's coming over the bridges, just the air, the way that air is moving in general.
So first of all, based on the EPA requirement, if you model, if you use metadata for modeling, at least you need to collect 1 year metadata. 1 year metadata. So in the modeling, actually, the model based on the hourly metadata to calculate hourly average concentration. So in 1 year data, actually, you use an 87, 60 hour conditions, okay? this 60 hours actually include, a lot of combination of wind speed, wind direction, temperature, right? So, there's a lot of combination, a lot of climatic conditions have been modeled,
I know a lot of our models don't actually work all the time. And so it's, and then also, when things fall out of compliance, how long are you giving them to get back into compliance? Because usually when you fall out of non-compliance, people have to do root cause corrective action. During root cause corrective action, that can take a day to a year. When if it's completely to, swinging to higher significant limits, then you're gonna have the people in the community that are gonna be suffering during that time. Usually while folks are suffering, while people are trying to get back into compliance, you give them a fine. I work for a company that has a $1 billion fine. We don't care because we make multiple billions of dollars. So what is the incentive? You see what I mean? To actually protect the people that are living in this area. And how long are you going to get them back into compliance? What is your structure? Like, where is your whole plan? Like, what's your process?
So like Roger talked about, I talked about, we have a compliance enforcement handbook, there's a process that is clearly laid out, so to talk or speculate on what the violation is or what that process is, I can't answer that, right? So each violation is looked at individually, following the process to get that facility in compliance timely, right? And making sure, it will vary depending on the violation, right? So, and I can't speculate on what time it is. No, I'm not going to speculate, sir. I can't speculate, I cannot speculate on what a violation is. So our compliance handbook, it may be as short as 10 days, or it might be a longer process where equipment needs to be installed and stuff like that, but they would have to modify operations because the facility is still required to operate within compliance with their permit.
Okay, and if they get a certain amount of complaints or violations that stack up, can they even be shut down? Or is it just a fine? You know what I mean? Can the facility actually be shut down if they are continuously non-compliant?
So there are processes and procedures for facilities that are out of compliance and non-compliance that they may not be able to operate until they can come back into compliance.
But they will not be shut down. So they can continue.
There are multiple remedies in our toolbox, right? So I'm not going to speak on remedies, and I'm not, once again, I'm not going to speculate on what that solution may be.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. I think Becky was next. Some people do.
Okay, I have a million questions, but my one important question is there any chance of this permit being denied?
So if the facility meets all the requirements under state, federal, and local regulations, ADEQ has no ability to deny that permit.
But if they don't meet all the requirements, will you deny the air quality permit?
Yeah.
If we saw that they were exceeding the national ambient air quality standard.
No, not if they were exceeding, before you even give them the permit, because they're not operating.
In a modeling scenario.
So if the facility does not meet all the requirements of the Clean Air Act and state federal regulations, they would have an opportunity to modify that permit. If they cannot meet those requirements.
They would have an opportunity to modify the permit.
Permit application, you can always modify it, so the process is.
So they can make up some bullshit numbers and.
No, I did not.
Let's let her answer.
No.
Okay.
We would have to agree with the changes that were made in that permit. So the facility has to meet the requirements of the federal, state, and local regulations. If a facility meets all those requirements, ADEQ will issue that permit.
So and as of right now, it looks like they're meeting all the requirements.
We are proposing yes, we are proposing the permit, right? But we want to hear from the community, and if there's something that we missed, which is possible, we will look at that and make modifications.
There's something that you missed, like lead poisoning, whatever the other gentleman said, he said that's not in the process, so you can't speak about it. There are things that you're missing.
So I think they've addressed the questions that have come up. That's what I've seen. you know, if you don't feel like that has been justified in your mind, we can't control all the thought processes that people have. I think that he's given an answer on that. So, do you have other questions or?
And also, is copper the main mineral they're gonna mine up here, or is there something else going on? Because we have 40 to 80 years of copper in Bangor.
Okay.
Why do we need another copper mine in our backyard right now?
Okay, let me ask the question. Are there any other items that are in that copper?
Copper is a primary mineral that they're mining.
Because the rumor mill has it that it's gold.
Okay, well, we're not going to speak to speculations and rumors. We're speaking to what the permit is for.
Want to bring it up?
Okay, thank you. Did we have Michelle here? Thank you, Michelle.
So this is my first meeting. I wish I'd been at some of the others. I've lived in Arizona my whole life. And I grew up playing in the Santa Ana Mountains. And I know this is not this is air quality, but it kind of sounds like it's a done deal. You've already approved the permit, you're already approving the permit, and this is kind of just, kind of make us all feel better about it. So, I guess, I feel like the teeth in your protocol to come after them if they're not complying is pretty weak. It'll never get shut down once it's started. And do any of you live out here? Yeah, that's what I thought.
No, we don't. But we do live in communities in Arizona, and Arizona is important to us. I'm also a native, so.
I mean, it's important to everyone.
We can't live in every area.
No, but I'm just saying that, I hope you guys, I don't know how you sleep at night sometimes, because this company shows that they can't be trusted.
Does anybody want to address that? It's more of a comment, is there a question? Michelle?
It's a comment, but it's kind of like, you're doing this community thing, which is great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
We want
it's
to be
really
here and
good.
listen.
But to what avail? I mean, if it's not gonna change your mind, then.
Yeah. Well, there are regulations that the state has, for us, that we have to fulfill. So we can't just go against those because people are concerned. Do you want to take this?
Well, then what is the point? What's the point of this? If you aren't gonna take what we say
We do consider it.
and make changes.
We do consider it.
So you're gonna rape this environment.
That's not what we want to do. That's miscategorizing.
I'm sorry, I think you're wrong.
Go ahead, Daniel.
So we do want to hear from the community, and when we hear from the community, there are times that we modify permit or permit conditions, so that is a standard operating process for us, right? We want to hear from everyone in this community. If there's something that we missed or overlooked, or something that makes sense that you provide to us in the formal public comment period, we will make modification to the permit. We have done it in the past, and we will continue to do it in the future.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, do we have Mega here? And I think Rob is the last person we're going to hear from after that. Mega? Okay, there she is. Oh, she's in. Okay. All right, then Rob. All right, you'll have our closing questions.
Thanks again.
Great, so I've got a couple questions. The first one, pretty straightforward. It's our understanding that in the permit, there's some loopholes for emergencies, malfunctions, startups, and shutdowns when excess emissions are allowed. Could you just say something about why is that so? Are those not modeled and included in the, are those excluded from the calculations that lead you to decide whether it's a class 1 or a class 2, for example?
I'm sorry, I missed the second question. I was confirming something with my team.
Sorry. Yeah. So the question is, if there are things sort of under emergency circumstances, startup, shutdown, emergencies, et cetera, where emissions are allowed to go, up above what they're otherwise allowed. My second first of all, I just wanted to see if that was so. And then the second part of that was, have you modeled those presumably infrequent events, and are they factored in to the total number of emissions that lead you to decide whether it's a class 1 or a class 2?
Yeah, I probably need to jump on the second question, but I can answer the first question. We have removed the emergency shutdown provision from the permit, so that has been removed, so yes. So what we do get in the community, that's something we've heard, so that is being removed from the permit. Second one, then, that's knowledge to help me.
So with respect to your second question, I think was whether we are truly quantifying those emissions that can occur in those periods. I just want to assure you that the way the permit is written and the way the limits are designed in the permit, there are no exceptions per se. Meaning, when we have a certain PM limit or even sulfur dioxide or nitrogen oxides, the limit applies at all times. So meaning, there is no real exception, there is no loophole, so there is not opportunities for them to emit more than what the permit says. The permit limits apply at all times.
Okay, that's good to hear. Next thing I have is just sort of a suggestion for you. I heard in the presentation, as best I could tell, it was a little fast and pretty technical, but it sounded like that you are requiring the mine to do some things that would be required under a class 1, as though it were a class 1, even though they're not absolutely required under a class 2. And I was wondering if you guys could put together a table for the things that would be required under class 1, things under class 2, and then the things that you were requiring sort of above and beyond the requirements for class 2. Do you see what I mean? So we can look at it and go, oh, well, I mean, you want to give them a class 2, but maybe, you're actually doing some things that bring it more in line with a class 1 and would make those feel more comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was kind of the purpose of showing that slide, comparing some of the requirements and some of the differences between a class 1 and class 2 permit. But yeah, we would be happy to put together some kind of table in our response to the summary that really gets down into the details and talks through every component. I tried to focus on some of the more major components of a class 1 versus class 2 permit, but we can get a little bit more granular with it for you guys for sure.
That would be great, thank you. And the last thing I just had, this is a comment someone else has to ask, but and that is a request that you guys also do some sort of meeting in Tucson proper. And I realize that you're restricted in what you can do, but I wanted to pass that on. Is that a remote possibility?
So we have heard that request. We need to consider it, is what I would say. We've heard from Aaron, I know you've heard from a few people, maybe 2 or 3. I don't know if it's a higher number than that. Rob, I'd like to get your contact information and maybe we can drill down on that. Yeah. Okay. I don't know that we can commit to that right here, but we can at least consider. So.
We have more than 1 million people in the metropolitan of Greater Tucson that are oblivious to what's going on here, and they need to be identified as part of the sector to understand the impact of these proceedings.
Yeah, we will consider that.
Thank you.
All right, so sorry. Just gonna finish that. All right, so we're gonna wrap things up. Thank you all so much for coming here tonight. We really appreciate your participation. We're gonna have Aaron give us some upcoming community engagement opportunity information. So I'll turn some time over to him, and then Daniel is going to close us out with some closing remarks. So go ahead.
So yeah, I want to thank everybody for asking questions, and your participation in this process is really, really important. The public comment period remains open until September 15th, and so we'd like to remind you again about the QR code and the link on the agenda, so that you can leave your formal comments. I don't think I have one.
Oh, you know what?
We're going to have a public hearing on September 10th at the same location and time. It's a formal process. You may have been here for the last one where people come up speaking to the panel, but the panel doesn't respond. But it's a formal process, so your comments will be included in a responsiveness summary, and then responded to at a later date. So with that, I'd like to pass it to Daniel Chekalinsky, our Air Quality Director.
Thank you, and I got my notes here also. I want to thank you all for coming to tonight's meeting and actively participating. In closing tonight's meeting, please know we value your comments and concerns, and ADEQ is committed to this community. Before we leave, I would like to let you know that I heard a couple themes. Really heard a lot about Class 1 versus Class 2 permit. We will make sure that's really clear in the responsive summary why it's a Class 2 permit. Concerns about PM tests, PM dust, PM 10, and PM 2.5. What are the controls appropriate, and from the health aspects. Also, a lot of comments on the sulfuric acid plant. So we heard those concerns. We're going to make sure we're clear on our permit and proposed permit and responsive to summary comments. Finally, I want to thank Corona Foothills Middle School for hosting tonight's community meeting. Without their assistance, this meeting would not have happened. If you didn't have an opportunity to ask questions, myself and some of my team will be sticking around to answer any questions you have. And finally, I wish you safe travels home, so thank you.